Good morning, everyone. And I would like to welcome you to the fourth session of the Pilipinas Conference. Today's session focuses on advancing multilateralism and strategic partnerships as we look at 2022's foreign and security policy outlook. We have over 1,000 registrations. Hopefully, they can all join us. But we're also thankful and would like to welcome all our distinguished speakers in today's session. Since 2014, exactly November of 2015, or 2014, I remember it right, our institute has started to track the geopolitical landscape. We started with looking at traditional challenges, non-traditional challenges, and now even evolving challenges. Just a month ago, in one of our policy briefs, we spoke of the need to advance stronger multilateral cooperation for a free and open Indo-Pacific. We have seen that recent security developments in the region reaffirm the need for a multilateral system that can contribute in achieving regional goals on peace and security. We see this being highlighted in the European Indo-Pacific strategy, the AUKUS alliance, the first ever in-person Quad meeting. Now, just this week, as we were preparing for this session, what we see in the news is about the Ayungin shoal incident. Yesterday, in one of my regular commentaries in the business world, I had to write about this. That China has continued to undermine our country's sovereignty and has threatened the livelihoods of Filipino fishermen. It continues to refuse and recognize the 2016 arbitral victory. Today, we would like to share our latest study on public perception. We partnered with the Social Weather Station, and we looked at public opinion on issues regarding the West Philippine Sea. And it continues to reflect what the general public tells us, whereby 82% of Filipinos across geographic and demographic sector would like government today and the future political leaders to assert our rights as stipulated in the 2016 decision of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. Again, 85% even of Filipinos would like the next president of the Philippines to look at alliances with other countries in defending the Philippines' territorial economic rights in the West Philippine Sea. This is a national survey reflective of opinion coming across age group, across socioeconomic groups. And when we ask, what are effective measures that the next president of the Philippines should do? 80% speak of the need to strengthen our military capability, especially the Navy and the Coast Guard. 65% would like us to conduct joint maritime patrols and military exercises with allied countries, and even fully implement the terms of the Visiting Forces Agreement and the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or EDCA. Who are these allies in the minds of the Filipino people? It's reflective on the trust ratings of countries. We continue to see traditional partners, allies like the United States of America, Australia, United Kingdom, and Japan being there on top, and even now the European Union. being seen as trusted countries by the Filipino people, again, across geographic and demographic sectors of Philippine society, with China being the least trusted. And even 79%, so exactly at least 8 out of 10 Filipinos, would like our government to build infrastructures on these vacant islands in the West Philippine Sea to assert their rights. This might not be a top gut issue for the Filipino people suffering from challenges brought about by the pandemic, but it speaks of an emotional issue. So I've always argued, and this one I wrote more than a month ago, that the next administration has the opportunity to rectify our foreign policy, that we need a stronger and more responsive foreign and security policy. It must be built for furthering strengthening the country's existing security partnerships. Again, good morning as I open this session, and allow me to introduce for welcoming remarks, retired Senior Justice of the Supreme Court, Justice Tony Carpio, a staunch advocate for asserting our rights in the West Philippine Sea. Justice Tony.
Thank you, Dindo. Good morning to everyone. I wish to thank the ADR Institute for inviting me to address you this morning. China and ASEAN marked last week its 30th year of dialogue relationship. China's President Xi Jinping declared that China does not seek hegemony and will not bully its smaller neighbors. His new ambassador to the United States reiterated that China does not seek to overturn the existing international system. This is all very obviously doublespeak. While vowing that China does not seek hegemony, China is actually acting as the hegemon in the South China Sea. China is doubling down on its claim to 85.7% of the South China Sea, encroaching on the entire extended continental shelves of Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines, Indonesia, Brunei in the South China Sea, and claiming large areas of their exclusive economic zones in the same sea. This assertion to maritime dominance in the South China Sea, patently contrary to international law and the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, is indisputable proof of China's hegemonic designs in the South China Sea. While affirming that it will not bully its smaller neighbors, China is actually doing just that in full view of the world. The Chinese Coast Guard has forcibly prevented Vietnam from exploiting its oil and gas within Vietnam's exclusive economic zone, forcing Vietnam's foreign partners, Spanish, American, and Russian companies, to give up their concessions within Vietnam's exclusive economic zone. Chinese Coast Guard vessels are also harassing Malaysian oil and gas companies that are drilling within Malaysia's exclusive economic zone. The Chinese Coast Guard has also harassed in the past Philippine Commission ships surveying in Reed Bank, which is within Philippine exclusive economic zone in the West Philippine Sea. Last November 16, 2021, Chinese Coast Guard vessels water cannoned Philippines resupply ships on their way to Ayungin Shoal, a submerged area which the arbitral tribunal had ruled is part of Philippine exclusive economic zone in the West Philippine Sea. It is quite obvious to the whole world that China is bullying its smaller neighbors in the South China Sea. While reiterating that China does not seek to overturn the existing international system, China has passed a new Coast Guard law that clearly violates in a very fundamental way the UN Charter and UNCLOS. China's new law authorizes its Coast Guard to use armed force to implement China's 9-dash line within Nine-dash line claim even beyond China's territorial sea, exclusive economic zone, and extended continental shelf in the South China Sea. This violates the fundamental principle in the UN Charter and UNCLOS that no country can use armed force or threat of armed force to settle territorial or maritime disputes. China's new Coast Guard law brings back the world to the turbulent era before the 1945 UN Charter, when armed force or war was a legitimate means of acquiring territory or settling disputes between states. China is obviously overturning the prevailing international system with its new Coast Guard law. How should ASEAN states, in the crosshair of China's hegemonic ambitions and bullying tactics, defend themselves? This ASEAN state should resort to UNCLOS, the basic multilateral treaty designed to regulate the use of the seas, and to which all the disputant states in the South China Sea dispute are parties. These ASEAN states should submit their overlapping maritime claims to compulsory arbitration under UNCLOS and invite China to join the arbitration to settle once and for all the South China Sea maritime dispute in accordance with the multilateral treaty designed to settle such dispute. This will settle finally the maritime boundaries, covering both the exclusive economic zones and the extended continental shelves boundaries of the Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, and China facing the South China Sea. If China does not join the arbitration, it will be the odd man out and it will be isolated. The world will support such arbitration as a peaceful means of settling the dispute, as it has supported the arbitration between the Philippines and China. Once the arbitration is concluded, the same ASEAN states can enter into a convention that in their exclusive economic zones and extended continental shelves in the South China Sea, there is freedom of navigation as guaranteed under UNCLOS and customary international law. Such a convention can be open to accession by other countries, including the United States, United Kingdom, France, Japan, Australia, India, and all other coastal states of the world. If China does not join this convention, it will be the odd man out and will again be isolated. The arbitration and the convention will be peaceful means of settling the South China Sea maritime dispute in accordance with the multilateral treaty, UNCLOS. As to the territorial dispute involving the islands above water at high tide in the Spratlys and Scarborough Shoal, sea level rise will submerge all these low-lying islands by the turn of this century and beyond. These submerged islands will form part of the exclusive economic zones of the adjacent coastal states that are within 200 nautical miles from these submerged islands. So while man must resolve the maritime dispute in the South China Sea, nature will resolve the territorial dispute. Thank you and a good day to everyone.
Thank you, Justice Tony. Always very substantive and powerful statement from you. And I enjoyed reading your commentary this morning. We cannot be already defeated. Thank you. Allow me to introduce the Secretary of the Department of National Defense, who will deliver our keynote address, Honorable Delphine Lorenzana. Sir, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Dindo. Professor Dindo Manhit, the President of Strat-Based ADR Institute, Justice Antonio Carpio, Secretary Chidoro Locsin, if he's around, General Manny Bautista, other distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Let me first congratulate the Strat-Based ADR Institute for organizing and continuing the Pilipinas Conference 2021, which has been going on for about 6 years now. The conference provides an excellent platform for the development of strategic ideas and multi-sectoral collaboration. I am happy to be here today to share my thoughts on the fourth session of this conference that centers on Philippine foreign and security policy outlook. The Greek historian and general Thucydides, writing on the history of the Peloponnesian War, remarked that the state of world affairs is a question between equals in power, where the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. This is actually similar to what the Chinese foreign minister reportedly said many years ago at the ASEAN meeting, that he said, we are a big country in your small countries, and you just have to accept that. This famous and often quoted line has been used in the study of realist international relations, and it provides us with a framework that will be used to jumpstart our discussions this morning. Question: should the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must? This is a question that could be addressed in this forum. And looking at the current global geopolitical setup, I think it's not. The strong cannot just run over the small states. The state of affairs in the Asia-Pacific has largely been shaped by geopolitics in the region. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, China launched its Belt and Road Initiative to usher in its global economic leadership. The initiative took on the task of building what can be called a new land and maritime Silk Road for China. Many countries were drawn in by the promise of economic progress, infrastructure development, and sound business environment. This seemingly peaceful rise of China as an economic superpower also coincided with their increasing military aggressiveness in the South China Sea. Despite the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling that China has no historic or legal basis for the so-called nine-dash line. Going back to Thucydides' notion that world affairs is a question between equals in power, the U.S. reaction to increasing Chinese dominance and influence in the region bears watching closely. U.S. and China may be falling into the Thucydides trap. This term is based on the quote by ancient Athenian historian Thucydides, which presented that the war between Athens and Sparta has been inevitable because of Spartan fears of the growth and rise of Athenian power. Or put simply, it means that when a great power's position as hegemon is threatened by an emerging power, there is likelihood of war between them. Is war inevitable between the US and China? According to Alison Graham, author of the book Destined for War, Can America and China Escape the Thucydides Trap? The statistics does not look good. In 12 of past 16 cases in which a rising power has confronted a ruling power, the result has been bloodshed. 12 out of 16 cases. I believe that everyone here is aware of current development, and depending on how these two superpowers, US and China, play the cards or the hands, it could be bloody confrontation or peaceful coexistence. As we are about to end 2021, it is indeed opportune to revisit our foreign and security policy of the Duterte administration. Dr. Renato de Castro will be sharing his assessment on this later. Its timing could not be more relevant as the May national elections approach. With a new administration by mid-2022, today's discussion will certainly be insightful for the next administration's strategic direction. Personally, I believe that such policies have been driven by both developments and disruptions in the Indo-Pacific region, given their profound impact on our national interest. The world has now realized the importance of the Indo-Pacific region in global politics and international security. driving countries to be more invested in regional affairs and more cognizant of the impact of its dynamics to their respective agenda. While the Indo-Pacific is relatively peaceful and stable as we speak, its security is riven by territorial and border disputes. These conflicts pose a direct threat to regional security, cause reckless degradation of marine resources, and deprive nations of opportunities for cooperation in the peaceful use of the seas. Of these disputes, the West Philippine Sea is our main concern. China remains aggressive in asserting its claims in the South China Sea, seriously challenging our interest in the area. Professor J. Batongbakal will tell us more about this as well as the best ways moving forward. Just last week, November 16, Chinese Coast Guard vessels water cannoned 2 Philippine resupply boats to our military detachment in Ayungin Shoal. We condemned this illegal act in strongest terms and directed the AFP to continue its resupply mission to that detachment. President Duterte has also made a strong statement against this bullying action during the ASEAN-China Commemorative Summit last week, chaired by President Xi Jinping. The international community supported us on this incident, citing international law and the ruling of the Permanent Court of Arbitration in 2016. I told the Chinese ambassador that no one can prevent us from doing what we have to do within the West Philippine Sea, where we have sovereign rights by international laws. At the backdrop of these disputes is the intensifying geopolitical rivalry, which will be discussed by Professor Richard Heydarian. As China continues to be dominant player in global and regional politics, the US is relentlessly confronting its growing influence. Weaker states like the Philippines, unfortunately, are caught in the middle. But the US or the Philippines not alone in countering China's hegemony. The Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or Quad, during former President Trump's time became a platform in confronting China, with the Quad members supporting US actions in the South China Sea. Recently, Australia, the United Kingdom, and the US, or the AUKUS, have banded together to counter China, adding another layer to the great power rivalry. Of course, the Americans have mutual defense treaties with us, the Philippines, the Australia, with Japan, and also with Korea. I appreciate that the second panel discussion of this conference would focus on non-traditional and evolving security challenges, evolving non-state actors, and involving non-state actors. Dr. Meli Caballero Anthony will later explain the significance of non-traditional security in the Philippine foreign and security policy, including the very important emerging cybersecurity field. Terrorism, which has now become transnational, is most concerning. Terror activities in any part of the world brings alarm to other countries, as homegrown terrorists are easily aided by imported terrorists. This is why we monitor developments in Afghanistan under the Taliban rule, especially the possibility that Taliban might resurrect Al-Qaeda's influence, given the dwindling resources of the local terrorist group. Equally alarming is the issue on climate change. While its impact is being felt all over the world, smaller and more vulnerable countries such as the island nations in the Pacific bear the brunt of its adverse effects. The World Bank has a study that says that with the effect of the climate change, maybe in 20 to 30 years, about 80 million people will be affected by rising waters, those islands in the Pacific and the Atlantic, and also those communities in the coastal areas of the regions in this the places in this Pacific region. Some countries, on the other hand, continue to overexploit marine resources, damage critical marine ecosystems, deplete underwater hydrocarbons, illegally drill oil in the South China Sea, and poach endangered marine creatures. The consequences of China's incursions on the marine environment will later on be discussed by Dr. Leo Florence Onda. But the toughest challenge of the moment is the COVID-19 pandemic. Beyond its public health aspect, it aggravated regional tensions. Major powers have capitalized on the crisis to boost their influence, even advancing disinformation and false narratives against one another. It also caused a rise in hybrid security threats like biosecurity risks and cybercrimes. As the Interpol reports, terrorists have profited from the COVID-19, accumulate income, strengthen the base, and intensify social divide. As 2021 draws to a close, it is likely that the security and foreign policy concerns will continue to persist in 2022 and even beyond. The question, therefore, is where does the Philippines fit and stand amid all these regional concerns? Certainly, multilateralism and strategic partnership is the way to go. Retired General Emmanuel Bautista, former Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces of the Philippines, will expound on this. As the Indo-Pacific region is set to face more uncertainties, there is more incentive for countries to band together, especially those with mutual interests. While resolving territorial disputes and balancing the geopolitical landscape remain tricky, non-traditional security threats present an impetus for cooperation. The Philippines therefore should take a more active role in promoting multilateralism. It should lead and call on Asean to be more proactive in asserting the interests of its member states instead of being a passive stakeholder. As for the ASEAN's response to the emergence of non-traditional security threats, you will hear more from Dr. Alma Salvador. The Indo-Pacific region is indeed in a very interesting times. With its increasing importance politically and economically, the whole world continues to have its eyes fixed on it. It is my earnest hope that today's speakers will impart their expertise to our policymakers, educators, strategists, and decision makers on how we could best deal with present and future traditional and non-traditional security concerns. In this way, we would be laying the foundation upon which the next administration can build on. Thank you very much for your attention. I wish you all a very productive conference. Mabuhay tayong lahat.
Thank you so much, Secretary Del Lorenzana, Secretary of the Department of National Defense. Always appreciate your strategic ideas, your thoughtfulness, and your continuous professionalism in leading the country's defense. Thank you so much, Paul. Allow me to our participants. I think we have nearly 500 participants already in our forum to introduce our moderator, Dr. Charmaine Lucha Willoughby. Dr. Willoughby, a member of the De La Salle University's International Studies Department, will moderate our two panels this morning. Dr. Charmaine.
Thank you very much, sir, and good morning to our distinguished guests, our distinguished speakers, and to the rest of our audience. It's always a pleasure to join the ADRI Strat-Based Institute in these types of events. It is my pleasure to introduce the first panel. Our first speaker is Mr. Richard Heydarian. He's a non-resident fellow of the Strat-Based ADR Institute. He's also a professorial chairholder in geopolitics at the Polytechnic University of the Philippines. Richard will present the evolving power configurations in the Indo-Pacific region and their possible implications. This is based in his Strat-Based ADRI policy paper entitled The Great Cauldron, China, the US, and the New Cold War in the Indo-Pacific. Richard, the virtual floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Charmaine, and thank you very much to folks in the ADR for this kind invitation. I hope you're hearing me well. I just thought maybe I can use just a quick PowerPoint just to present some of the key points that I raised in the paper. Medyo mahaba yung paper, I think between 10 to 15,000 yung initial drafting. So I'll just try to give a kind of a flavor of that paper within the next 10 minutes. Let me just share the screen. Okay. All right, so this is the, okay. All right, so just quickly, I'm gonna discuss about evolving geopolitical dynamics in the Indo-Pacific within the next 10 minutes by just focusing, I think, on the key points that I raised in the paper and also in my latest books in the Pacific and an upcoming book on China's new empire. I mean, first of all, I think whenever we want to understand what the rise of China means, I think one of the most useful persons to go to is a former Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew. I think in one of his most revealing interviews with Henry Kissinger and with Graham Allison, he mentioned that the rise of China will be so substantial and consequential that it will require actually finding a new balance, not only a tactical balance of power readjustment by rivals and neighboring countries. And I think that reflection that Prime Minister Lee made more than a decade ago in many ways is still ringing with us, and it's something that is worth giving attention to. And I think that's the reason why a lot of us are scratching our head and trying to wonder how to deal with China. What makes China really special, and I like the fact that Secretary Lorenzana raised the Thucydides trap issue, is that it's not like US is relatively declining and China is relatively rising. It's just the speed by which China is catching up with the United States that is mind-boggling, and some would say historically unprecedented. So the great historian Paul Kennedy, in his book, The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, mentioned that there tends to be a time lag, noticeable time lag, between the trajectory of states' relative economic strength and the trajectory of its military territorial influence. Now, I don't see much of a time lag here when it comes to China. It seems just as its economy has been expanding, it has also been rapidly expanding its military capabilities. And contrary to some of the caricature of China as a supposed paper tiger, given its not so good performance against Vietnam in 1979, and the fact that it has not been involved in any major conventional warfare quite a while, is that actually China at once, it's developing its asymmetric capabilities, but also its conventional capabilities. And if you look at China's defense spending, it's almost 2/3 of that of the United States if you use proper measures, as the economist has done recently, by using purchasing power parity rather than nominal GDP. So for those who underestimate China's conventional capability, let's not forget that recently China launched the world's first two-engine fifth generation fighters. They may not be there yet, but China is working on the engines, and the strides that China has made has actually impressed a lot of people, including Russia and United States, among others. Also, China has been testing hypersonic missile capability, although they have been denying it in their official statements, but that has huge implications, and especially in terms of China's counter-intervention strategy on Taiwan, on South China Sea, among others. So in short, do not underestimate China's ability also in terms of catching up with US and closing in the gap when it comes to US qualitative gap. But also in quantitative terms, it's incredible how far China has gone in terms of catching up with the United States. So if you look at this data, China's defense spending, actual defense spending by purchasing power parity, is almost close to $600 billion. And the difference between China and US is that US has bases all around the world, has obligations all around the world, while China, as a regional power in East Asia, can concentrate much of that defense spending here in East Asia. So if you look at it, more and more, China is matching the US quantitatively and also increasingly qualitatively. And it's that rapid change in the balance of military power that I think has caught a lot of people's attention. Now, that in many ways is a reflection of China's rising economic profile. So we see within a generation, China goes from a low-income country to the second largest economy in the world. So in this, for instance, in this graph, we see that China is the fastest catching up rising power compared to other historical precedents like USSR, Germany, Weimar Germany, Nazi Germany, and Imperial Japan, right? And of course, because of COVID-19, China's ability to catch up with the US by nominal GDP, it already has surpassed the US in purchasing power parity could be accelerated. And within this decade, China may be back to where it was in the middle of 19th century as the biggest economy in the world. We also see in the past 3 decades how rapidly China has changed the dynamics of economic power in our region. Japan used to be the engine of industrialization and investment. Now that has almost reversed. Look at this X-shape, these two X-shape graphs showing the share of China's regional trade and regional GDP. Now, none of this is to say that, oh my God, China is going to take over the world and we're going to live in a Pax Sinica. Well, the reality is that there are a lot of vulnerabilities, structural vulnerabilities in Chinese economy, including what we see right now in the real estate sector, among other things. But betting on China collapsing due to some combination of domestic structural vulnerabilities or political crisis is not strategy. That is not how you do policy. And I think that's not the healthiest way to look forward. Although, of course, you should not also overestimate China's rise. Now, let's also look at a number of surveys that show that, for instance, in ASEAN, this is an ICS survey, shows that actually there's a lot of skepticism also about China's Belt and Road Initiative. That is not true. Maybe some people here or there are very impressed by China's BRI, but actually when you ask thought leaders and policymakers in ASEAN, they're not as impressed. And I think they have a much more nuanced and realistic understanding of China's investment footprint and its ability to deliver on its pledges. If you look at the survey by Pew, for instance, it shows that US is still by far the most preferred world leader by almost all key countries in the Indo-Pacific region and Europe, right? So the gap is just huge. Only in places like Tunisia, for instance, we see that China is more preferred than the United States. But in almost all key countries in the Indo-Pacific, Europe, among others, US is still by far the more preferred. And by the way, this survey was conducted during the Trump administration, so you can imagine the situation has improved. But what I want to really talk about and what I discuss in my paper is not really US-China competition alone, but also the rise of the middle powers. It's something that I discuss in my book in the Indo-Pacific the other year, where actually doubts over the Trump administration's foreign policy, its commitment to the region, its commitment to the liberal international order, among other things. One of the unintended consequences of that was actually to mobilize and encourage and nudge so-called middle powers to be much more proactive in upholding a free and open order in the Indo-Pacific. Now, of course, there's a debate about what's the definition of middle powers, but just to simplify it, middle powers generally have 3 attributes. They have sufficient capacity for self-defense and projection of power in their immediate region or beyond. They have coalition building capability and constructive contribution to the international peace and stability. And they have a degree of credibility and creativity in their diplomacy and soft power. So you can imagine a lot of countries that are not named US or China can meet that criteria. And clearly Japan, at the very minimum, is a proactive and one of the leading middle powers in the world. And we see that actually, if you look at Japan, many people don't discuss this as much, but Japan actually outpaces China in terms of new big ticket infrastructure investment in many key countries in Southeast Asia. So everyone talks about BRI among others, but actually it's Japan that is still the leading investor in Southeast Asia when it comes to big ticket investments. And what we see is that it's not only Japan, but Japan, Australia, other middle powers, the European Union, all of them have been coming up with all sorts of different alternatives to China's Belt and Road Initiative over the past year or so, at least. And I think the numbers we're looking at is pretty significant because this is not about matching China on a renminbi to renminbi basis, but it's about mobilizing private sector investment and high quality investment to reinforce global governance standards when it comes to infrastructure investment. Interestingly, when ASEAN thought leaders by ICS were asked, who are your most preferred external partners, Japan and the European Union consistently top those surveys. So I think that says a lot about the receptiveness in regions like ours to growing role by Japan, European Union, among others. And I think this is important. Now, of course, there has been discussions about AUKUS, Quad, among other things, but this is the more military dimension of the growing role of the middle powers. But I think their role, their infrastructure development role, diplomatic role, among others, is also very important, not to mention in terms of vaccine diplomacy. We see Japan, we see the European Union also playing a very important role in this part of the world. But let me try to go to the final part of my discussion, which is really what should we do after the Duterte administration? Kasi patapos na tong administration na to, how should we approach this issue? Now, 3 years ago, I wrote an article about China's chimera because everyone was panicking, like, oh my God, China is gonna put us into a debt trap. They're gonna invest so much that we're gonna be malulutang tayo sa utang, no? But I always was doubtful about that, looking at patterns of China's pledges and actual investments over time. Sometimes the ratio is 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 based on some of the studies, including by Rand Corporation in the past. And if you look at the latest data that came out by Data, published by the Nikkei Asia, look at how small even the hidden debt exposure of the Philippines is to China, which just shows how limited China's investments in the Philippines has been over time, and quite a failure that President Duterte's economic policy toward China has been, at least in terms of getting big ticket infrastructure investment. In fact, I call it not debt trap, I call it pledge trap. That China pledged a lot of investment, and those promises alone convinced President Duterte to soften his foreign policy. And for me, that's probably even worse than debt trap, right? Because pledge alone, China is getting more bang out of imaginary buck. That's the problem we're having right now in the case of the Philippines, unlike in Malaysia, where actually there was almost huge levels of investments, right? Now, the second thing we have to look at is conditions on the ground have actually worsened over the past 4 or 5 years, despite President Duterte's efforts to de-escalate tensions. Militarization of the islands, the fake islands in the KIG and Spratlys are almost complete. The same thing with Woody Island, among others. But what we are seeing since 2019 is what I call militiaization of the disputes. China is now more aggressively using armada of militia forces to harass our position, harass our troops, and yung nangyari sa Ayungin is just the latest manifestation of this very disturbing trend. Number 3, we definitely have to have good continuity. Thanks to Secretary Lorenzana, the AFP, and the adults in the room, essentially, we have been doing a much better job than all previous administration, perhaps since Marcos, in fortifying our position there in Pag-asa, Calayan Group of Islands, and also we're transitioning from the second horizon to the third horizon of AFP modernization program. Our good colleague, Dr. De Castro, has written extensively and greatly on this. So I really refer you to him for details on this. But in fairness to the Duterte administration, Secretary Lorenzana, we have overseen a significant increase and improvement in our aerial and naval capacity over the past few years, and hopefully that will continue under the next administration. Number 4, revamped alliances. This is very important. Okay, I'm glad VFA is back. Sure, VFA was the software of our alliance, but the real deal when it comes to China and the South China Sea is EDCA. That is what we need to operationalize in the coming years, because under EDCA, the Americans were supposed to have the kind of forward deployment capability to deter further Chinese encroachments into our waters. Because under EDCA, dapat binibigyan ng mga Amerikano greater rotational access to key bases like Basa and Bautista Air Base na malapit dun sa Scarborough Shoal and Spratlys. And of course, the ability for the Americans also to preposition weapons and other kind of important hardware in order to help the Philippines' minimum deterrence capability. That was the intention behind EDCA, and EDCA has not been implemented in its full sense yet, and that's something that the Biden administration has to discuss with the next administration in the Philippines. And lastly, middle power diplomacy. As much as we have to focus on US, we have to focus on China, we also have to focus on other middle powers, the Quad powers, Indo-Pacific powers from Europe, right? The British, the French, the Germans, who are getting more and more involved in this part of the world, but also minilateral diplomacy. ASEAN has not been very helpful on the South China Sea issue and holding the line on China in general. And I'm a little bit worried about Cambodia taking over next year, but it is what it is. But I think we can have issue-specific, high-impact and sustained cooperation with like-minded powers in ASEAN, including Vietnam, including Indonesia, including Malaysia, on areas where we have shared concerns with China, but also with other Indo-Pacific powers. So I'll keep it there. Thank you very much. Looking forward to the question and answer.
Thanks very much, Richard, for discussing how China's rise is actually anchored and, in fact, is embedded in this liberal rules-based international order that we've been in since the post-Second World War era, and also where middle powers fit in this configuration. Our next speaker is Professor Renato De Castro. He's a trustee and program convener at the Strat-based ADR Institute. He's also a professor of international studies at De La Salle University. Professor De Castro will share his assessment of the Duterte administration's foreign policy decisions and his policy recommendations for the next administration. This is discussed in his special study entitled A National Security Strategy for the 17th Philippine President, the Case for a Limited Balancing Strategy. Sir?
Okay, I'll share my screen. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be back in this activity by the Albert Del Rosario Institute for International Strategic Studies. Always a great pleasure and honor on my part. So I'll go straight to my presentation. My presentation is based on a number of peer review articles I have worked on, and of course, the most recent research I did as part of the project for the ADRI on the possible agenda for the next president. And I focused on the notion that you have, of course, some changes that had happened in this administration, starting from what we call appeasement to what I now considered as limited balancing. Let me go straight to my presentation. Last year, during an interview with Secretary Teodoro Locsin, he was asked the question, is the Duterte administration adopting a policy of appeasement? He answered, the Philippines policy in dealing with China is the opposite of appeasement, as of course it consistently asserted its territorial rights. And he continued to begin with, you look at the opposite of appeasement, which he of course claimed every transgression incursion made by China or even a suspicion is immediately reported, and we craft diplomatic note. Now I will put a sort of a muscle to Secretary Locsin's argument. Of course, we have to understand the context in 2018. Okay, let's look at what of course had happened. I'm just given limited time, so I have to breeze through my presentation and focus more on my recommendation. Of course, a major security problem that the Philippines has faced since, of course, the second decade of the 21st century is China's maritime expansion. This, of course, began in March 2010 when China declared that along with Taiwan, Tibet, the South China Sea is one of the core interests of China. And of course, you have the assertion of China, starting, of course, during the time of the Aquino administration. So the late President Benigno Aquino implemented a strategy of challenging China. I will mention later, of course, the major efforts he undertook to effect this balancing strategy against China. And of course, supposedly since 2016, you have a change in the policy. You have the unraveling of the balancing policy of the Aquino administration against China to a policy that has been, of course, called appeasement. But after 5 years of pursuing a policy of appeasement, the defense, military, and foreign affairs establishment, of course, led by Secretary Delfin Lorenzana for the DND and the Armed Forces of the Philippines, and Secretary Teodoro Locsin, who have, of course, been questioning the policy of the Duterte administration, and of course has pushed for a reversal of the strategy that I would label as limited balancing strategy. The current administration now is pondering on a grand strategy of limited hard balancing. The strategy requires building up the Philippine military external defense capability, maintaining its alliance with the United States, and of course, making security arrangement with other middle powers like Japan, South Korea, and of course, Australia. So the goals are to develop a credible defense capability for the armed forces, while at the same time promoting and strengthening comprehensive and strategic alliances that the Philippines has, of course, forged with a number of middle powers. Of course, this is based on the notion that appeasement is not simply working. So we have to think of plan B. So the presentation, of course, examined the prospect of limited balancing, not only as an impromptu de facto reaction to the failure of appeasement policy, but of course, a grand strategy for the next Philippine president. Of course, this is assuming that we would elect a president who will stand up against China. We cannot simply afford another president who would always say, China is too powerful. We cannot challenge China. We cannot anymore afford another 6 years of defeatism and appeasement. So this is, of course, the challenge. I'll just breeze through this notion of grand strategy. I'll just focus on the three major approaches when we have to deal with an emerging power like China. Number one, of course, is balancing, strengthening the capability in terms of the military and, of course, alliance. And of course, appeasement, and we're familiar with the appeasement policy implemented by Britain and France during the Munich conference with Hitler, which of course led to the aggressive power becoming more aggressive simply because of the fact that it will not encounter any opposition from the targeted countries. And of course, the notion of limited hard balancing, which relied on limited arms buildup, maintaining the alliances and strategic partnerships that allowed effort sharing of resources, but not definitely offensive warfare or operational coordination that could, of course, lead to a greater prospect of what Secretary Lorenzana mentioned as the possibility, the threat, a possibility of war, which of course the Philippines could hardly afford. I will not discuss this in total when you talk in terms, of course, of the Aquino administration balancing policy, characterized, of course, by the start of the modernization program of the Armed Forces of the Philippines. Then, of course, the strengthening of the alliance with the United States. And of course, what has been mentioned before is, of course, the filing of the case in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea Arbitral Tribunal. So let's look at the Duterte administration appeasement policy. What are the three elements of this appeasement policy? I'll just have to breeze through this. Number one, of course, is trying to downgrade or separate from our alliance with the United States, which President Duterte announced in October 2016 when he was in Beijing. Then, of course, candid intention to change Manila's hardline policy towards Beijing, marked, of course, by the decision to set aside the ruling when it came out in July 2016. And of course, accepting China's core precondition on how to manage the South China Sea dispute, shelving sovereignty issue, discussing, of course, the dispute in a bilateral forum, agreeing on bilateral engagement, and of course, joint development. So what led to this policy from appeasement to limited hard balancing? This coincided, of course, with the, for the first time, the Philippines came out with a national security strategy that basically talks about, of course, changes or threats that are happening in the environment, but of course, it never mentioned a specific source of threat, and that is, of course, China. Rather, it focused on, it mentioned the three major challenges with what I would call a shift from appeasement to limited hard balancing. And what are, of course, the reason why, of course, this stems from a realization that despite its effort to appease China, the Duterte administration simply doesn't want to put the Philippines simply on the fate of the Philippines on the hands of definitely a more powerful and aggressive China, making yourself extremely vulnerable. By appeasing an expansive power, the Philippines, of course, accepts and faces greater vulnerability in a false hope that by trying to, of course, appease China, Chinese expansion would, of course, be stated or, of course, diverted or, of course, be managed. I think this is very naive on the part of the this administration. Of course, this policy of limited balancing is reflected in what I mentioned earlier, funding the AFP modernization program up to the second horizon, downgrading, but not necessarily terminating the alliance. And this is, of course, reflected by the decision of President Duterte last July 2021 to end the termination process of the visiting force agreement. Much, of course, we have to credit Secretary Lorenzana and, of course, Secretary Teodoro Locsin for trying to convince the president that we cannot simply drop our alliances with the United States like a hot potato. And of course, bolstering Philippine security partnership with Japan and other, of course, middle powers. So what could be the nature of a grand strategy for the 17th president, or applying or adopting limited balancing as a grand strategy for the next 6 years after, of course, we have this historic election in May 2022. The Duterte administration was, of course, simply confronted by the fact, this was mentioned earlier by Professor Heydarian, China pledged the money, but China never actually brought the money. Of course, leaving the government build program simply hanging in the air with no Chinese money, except, as Professor Heydarian mentioned, it's Japan that basically provided the funding, and of course, increasing naval presence and assertiveness in the artificial island, which of course pushed the administration to reluctantly, of course, drop appeasement as a policy and slowly, but I would emphasize the point, reluctantly embrace a policy of limited hard balancing. The strategy of limited hard balancing towards China stems from, of course, current realization that the policy of appeasement on the part of a weaker party like the Philippines would simply put, our strategic stakes in the hands of a powerful country that's simply bent on expanding into our maritime domain, and of course, always harboring this hostile intention that the Philippines, of course, is a major obstacle to its expansion into the South China Sea. And of course, the Philippines, despite its efforts to appease China, is still a formal treaty ally of the United States. The policy of limited hard balancing requires accepting that China is a major economic military power in the region, and we must maintain a healthy and economic and diplomatic relation with this emergent power. But, and of course, this is the caveat, the Philippines must seek to mitigate adverse externalities of this geographic reality. We have to address China's assertiveness, coercive behavior, territorial expansion by developing credible military capability, not of course for warfare, but just to ensure that we have, of course, options, and of course, harnessing countervailing coalition of major powers who are already here. You have Quad, you have our bilateral security alliance with the United States. We have our security partnership with Australia, Japan, and to a certain degree, South Korea, and even India. And of course, the fact that you have these countervailing powers that are willing, of course, to constrain China, not only in the South China Sea, but of course in the whole Indo-Pacific region. So we could not simply say that China is powerful and we have simply no choice but to submit to China. The reality states a different equilibrium. Limited hard balancing involves the Philippines' effective coordination of both military diplomatic order to obtain outcomes contrary to China's preference, of course, of controlling a large portion of the West Philippine Sea, and of course, the first island chain, and seeks to constrain China's unilaterally imposing its preference on littoral states like the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and basically telling us it's a matter of fait accompli. In a way, this is an adoption of what Taiwanese president said, in one of her speeches last month. We should not simply take the road that, of course, been laid down to us by China. We have to exercise our choices. So what are the recommendations? Number one, of course, we have to accept the fact that the policy of limited hard balancing was a result of the Defense Department under Secretary Lorenzana, and of course the military, Foreign Affairs, Secretary Lorenzana's establishment of questioning President Duterte's appeasement policy, leading to this administration belated realization after, of course, since last year, that we need an impromptu strategy aimed at constraining Chinese revisionist agenda in the South China Sea. The key challenge for the next Philippines is to transform the current administration unplanned makeshift impromptu policy of hard balancing into a well-thought, comprehensive, and formal grand strategy that the Philippines should adopt in the next 6 years. So the policy is already there in the latter part of the Duterte administration. It's just a matter of putting it as part of a grand strategy and of course articulated in a national security strategy. So these are my recommendations. I can only provide about 3 or 4 on the chapter I submitted for ADRI's project. I have about 10. Immediate formulation of a National Security Council, of course, led by the President and the National Security Advisor, of a new national security policy, and more importantly, a national security strategy based on the arbitral ruling on the South China Sea. What do I mean by this? Number one, the assumption that our security orientation should be focused on the maritime domain. We cannot anymore afford to focus on terrorism, on illegal drugs, on crime. Rather, the focus should be on the maritime domain. This is where, of course, the challenge would be emanating from. Then, of course, developing the necessary capabilities that will enable us to address the challenge in that maritime domain, and that is, of course, China that's bent on maritime expansion. Meaning, of course, the development of the Philippine Navy, the Philippine Coast Guard, the Philippine Air Force, and of course, ensuring that the Army would provide adequate support to this forces that would, of course, project Philippine power into our maritime domain. Build the AAP's territorial defense capability with a specific focus on developing the ability to wage, just in case it push comes to shove, wage asymmetric warfare in the country's maritime domain, which of course has already been there since the Aquino administration, the development of asymmetric warfare capability, increasing defense budget, while of course effecting reforms to reduce proportion of the budget allocated from personal expenditures to capital expenditures. Strengthening, of course, the Philippine-US alliance by the implementation of EDCA, bilateral strategic diplomatic and public dialogue mechanism that will advance not only an alliance based on dealing with the challenge in a maritime domain, but a very comprehensive alliance that would enable the Philippines and the United States to address even non-traditional security concerns, like of course the pandemic, enhancing Philippine security partnership with other American allies as Japan, the Republic of Korea, Australia, while at the same time leveraging on existing and newly formed multilateral arrangements that are committed in defending the rules-based international orders. And of course, you have the Quad and the AUKUS, and even of course, ASEAN. And I think this will be my last presentation. My last slide. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor De Castro, for such an interesting discussion on the strategic options for the Philippines and the limitations, as well as the consequences of the policy of appeasement. We also welcome the recommendations for how we can possibly move towards a limited balancing strategy for the next administration. At this point, I would also like to invite our audience. If you have any questions whatsoever, please start typing them up in our Q&A box, and we will have some time for Q&A and exchange of ideas later on. But for now, I am very pleased to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Jay Batumbakal is the director of the UP Institute of Maritime Affairs and Law of the Sea. He will present his analysis on the current situation in the West Philippine Sea and how security developments in the disputed waters can affect the future direction of the country's foreign and security policy. Jay? Oh, apologies. I think we can jump ahead first to General Bautista's presentation, and we'll just come back to Jay later on. General Bautista is a former chief of staff of the AFP, and he will share his insights on the ways to ensure peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific through the enhancement of strategic partnerships with like-minded states in the region. General Bautista?
Thank you very much, and let me share my screen. Okay, so good morning to all of you. It's an honor to be here and exchange views with such a distinguished set of participants. Allow me to share some thoughts on the topic ensuring peace and stability through strategic partnerships, given the context of the geopolitical rivalry and the key players in the region. And a lot of discussion has been made already earlier, and I shall build upon the earlier presentations of the previous speakers. The US-China strategic competition has profound impact on peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific. While we have an incumbent superpower in the region, the United States, its leadership is now being challenged by China, a rising military and economic power. And aggravating this already tense situation are flashpoints that can trigger a conflict between the two rival powers. The main rivals, US and China, are diametrically opposed in terms of vision, intent, ideology, circumstances, and direction. The US vision is a free and open Indo-Pacific with the intent of maintaining global leadership. It is the world's only superpower and world leader, and belatedly, it rebalanced to the Indo-Pacific as it now recognizes China as its #1 competitor. On the other hand, China's vision is to restore its Middle Kingdom status with the intent of replacing US global leadership. It is a rising world power and is now challenging the current world order and is in an aggressive westward expansion. And while we talk about the main rivals, also mentioned earlier, there are also other significant players in the region. The middle powers, India, Australia, Japan, and South Korea. The first three are part of the Quad. South Korea's circumstances, though, inhibit it from joining the Quad. It is, however, a US ally together with Japan and Australia. Note that all of them have potential conflicts with China, and this has not only further gravitated them closer to the US, but has also brought them closer together. We also have multilateral groupings, ASEAN, and lately Quad and AUKUS, playing a prominent role in regional dynamics. Other European powers and Canada also have stakes in the region. And with that as a backdrop, let us now go to the challenges we face. The principal challenge we face in the region is China's growing assertiveness. This has led to heightened tension and growing sense of uncertainty in terms of how far China is willing to go in pursuit of its strategic intent, and also how far the US will remain committed to the region. China's assertiveness is manifested in its aggressive behavior and increased military activities. Note that China's military activity is deliberate. It is part of a grand plan. What they are doing or what they will do, they have already figured out decades ago. Bear in mind that China is determined to implement its plan, whether now or in the future, when the timing and opportunity presents itself. There are consequences to China's aggressive behavior. First, there is now an increasing wariness of China's intent and behavior, and this has led to the US pivot to Asia, and also the emergence of Quad and AUKUS, the involvement of other European powers. And territorial disputes are heating up and have become flashpoints that can trigger a conflict. Finally, China is getting more aggressive amidst US and the world's preoccupation with COVID-19. How are countries reacting then? To start with, many countries are doing a balancing act in terms of accommodating both powers. While some countries can afford to stay in the middle, others are in a more difficult position and are forced to take sides. We are also witnessing alliance formations by middle powers. There is growing pushback by those directly affected: Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Finally, we are now seeing an unprecedented level of defense spending by many countries in the region, including the Philippines. For the Philippines in particular, the ramifications are more direct. First, a US-China confrontation will inevitably involve the Philippines because the Philippines has a mutual defense treaty with the US. And regardless of whether we are a treaty ally or not, the Philippines is a key terrain amidst this competition. And either of the protagonists will want to control the Philippine archipelago to gain a marked advantage over the other. Second, but more significantly, irrespective of the US-China rivalry, China's territorial hegemony directly impinges on Philippine security. Its aggressive actions have resulted into transgression of Philippine sovereignty and sovereign rights. Its militarization of the South China Sea now poses a direct threat to the Philippine archipelago by virtue of proximity. And even as we speak, China is employing gray zone strategy versus the Philippines. While we face challenges, there are opportunities before us. First is the prospect of further enhancing Philippine-US alliance. Our alliance with the US has both strategic and operational significance. At the strategic level, the alliance serves Philippine national interest. The alliance will remain relevant for as long as there are threats to national security beyond our capabilities to address. Given an uncertain future, there is wisdom in providing for insurance to hedge against adversities. At the operational level, US-Philippine alliance is central to achieving a minimum credible defense posture. From the military perspective, the MDT is the cornerstone of Philippine deterrence. The prospect of US intervention has dissuaded a more aggressive posture towards the Philippines. In addition, the MDT aids in the capability upgrade of the Philippine military. There are favorable developments that contribute to an enhanced relationship. Recently, there has been a marked shift in US policy manifested by its pivot to Asia and the recognition that China is now the #1 threat. While this is largely driven by domestic and strategic considerations, it brings to the fore the convergence of interests between the Philippines and the United States. Other prospects are the favorable view Filipinos have for the US, providing an imprimatur for a more robust alliance. Also, the change in administration in the US and later on, the possibility of one in the Philippines raises the prospect of a positive shift in policy. What needs to be done? First is to strengthen the cohesiveness of the alliance, given the seemingly deliberate effort by external parties to weaken it. Cohesiveness is key to alliance credibility and its deterrent effect. Second is internal. The need for both countries to manage the alliance and navigate it through the respective national processes and discourse. Third, we need to be a more responsible alliance partner. Alliances are two-way, and both parties must be able to contribute their fair share to making the alliance mutually beneficial. Fourth is to make the alliance more responsive to the evolving challenges. While the alliance was initially premised on traditional threats and therefore traditional ways of dealing with it, adjustments must now be made to make it more attuned to the gray zone nature of the current threat. Finally, we have to ensure US policy continuity by deliberately trying to shape US policy. The second opportunity before us is the prospect of expanding our strategic partnerships. Expand in terms of further strengthening existing partnerships and alliances, and also in terms of more alliances and partnerships on top of what we already have. This can either be bilateral or multilateral, including minilaterals. There is value in expanding Philippine strategic partnerships. The logic is to advance a multilateral approach in addressing our West Philippine Sea issue. By expanding alliances and partnerships, deterrence is further enhanced. Before us are favorable prospects we can explore. One, there is now growing realization by more countries of the threat that China presents, placing them in a similar situation like us. Two, the arbitral ruling of 2016 elevates us to the moral and legal high ground. So what can we do to make that happen? First, we must not in any way concede this moral and legal high ground. There are actions by certain sectors that are damaging the arbitral ruling, and this needs to stop. Secondly, we need to be a more responsible member of the international community so we can leverage it to bear upon the enforcement of the rule of law. Finally, we need more consistency of policies over a longer period of time and even over changes in administration. That concludes my presentation, subject to your questions, clarifications, or even contrary opinion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Manny, and thank you as well for centering the alliance and leveraging our strategic partnerships. I wonder if Jay is now ready to join us.
Yes, sorry. Hi.
Okay.
Mr. May. Okay. Thank you. Oops, somebody's okay, sorry about that. Good morning, everyone, and apologies for the slight change in the sequencing. Thank you for inviting me to this important discussion, particularly this session on advancing multilateralism and strategic partnerships, as well as Philippine foreign policy and its outlook for the year 2022. Being the last speaker, actually, I mean, a lot of what I originally wanted to say has already been more explicitly stated by our speakers. So, in a way, there's not much I can contribute except perhaps three major points that I would like to sort of focus on. Okay. Now, of course, before that, we also are aware that the country is approaching another major crossroads in foreign policy, and that's why we're having this discussion. The thing is, in the past 5.5 years, the People's Republic of China has engaged in an all-out effort to pursue its core interests in the Southeast Asian Maritime Commons, that is the South China Sea. And in 2016, it suffered a serious legal setback because the Philippines near total victory in the South China Sea arbitration. And this saw an international tribunal invalidate its excessive, expansive, and ambiguous claim in the South China Sea. And from that time onwards, China has dug in even more and engaged in a multidimensional effort to actively resist and fight the legal and moral imperatives of the arbitral award, to the point of challenging not only the tribunal's judgment, but even international law itself. And China's effort in this regard is striking at the very heart and foundation of the international legal order of the oceans, seeking to impose and justify a singular and exceptional position for itself and this vast area of oceanic space. It does so at the expense of legitimate rights and interests of smaller Southeast Asian states along its southeastern periphery, even though the recognition of such rights and interests in their favor has already been carefully and comprehensively settled by the international community in a decade of negotiations for the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Now, assisting China in this effort, unfortunately, has been 5 years of permissive, accommodating, fatalistic, and meek foreign policy, driven by the mistaken notion that prostrating the country before its more powerful neighbor would be met with sympathy and rewards. Our people were regaled with tales of the coming boom of Chinese-sponsored infrastructure projects, financial support, investments, economic rewards, jobs, business opportunities, none of which came to fruition. And the president claimed that for the benefit of the country, he needed China more than anything else in our national life. I mean, that's almost a direct quote. And he chose to accommodate China and squander many opportunities to stand up to China as it continued to illegally press deeper and deeper into the Philippine EEZ and continental shelf. Repeatedly, he justified inaction and permissiveness as the appropriate response, fearing and trying to make us afraid of a supposed threat of war, and always emphasizing that China's missiles will reach the capital in 7 minutes. And he distanced the Philippines from long-standing and traditional allies and friends, cussing and cursing along the way, and dragging his feet on vital security arrangements such as the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, even threatening the pivotal Visiting Forces Agreement, which are all intended, which are all already primed to enhance our maritime domain awareness and enhance our capability to defend ourselves from external threats. And thereby he exposed our marine heritage, our natural resources, to massive taking and destruction. It was only this year, after China had already succeeded in achieving its tactical objectives and laying the groundwork for creating more levers and means of exercising de facto administrative military and paramilitary control of the South China Sea, it's only this year that this posture was adjusted. But now we are left to face the problem that has been exacerbated by these policies. And as we retreated, as the Philippines retreated from China, it expanded into the West Philippine Sea, making it even harder now to push back. Sorry, something's coming in. Okay, now let me go to the 3 points. No? They are, number one, continuity or change. No? The second is layering the cabbage, and the third is the opportunity for crisis. Okay, now for continuity or change, obviously it's about the elections. No, we will not. We may not survive, or rather, the natural resources and exclusive rights entitlements that we have over the West Philippine Sea will not survive another 6 years of official neglect and lack of adequate protection, no, of indifference and recklessness, shall we say. No? Living resources particularly are finite and under threat from both deliberate overexploitation by malign forces and by degradation from pollution and deteriorating environmental conditions. So continuity of the current administration's over-accommodation and deference will only fuel disaster. Okay? Of the candidates running for the position president, we really need to examine carefully and consider not only their present statements or positions about the West Philippine Sea, because obviously these are merely meant to curry favor with the electorate in the run-up to the elections. We should also look at their own track record vis-a-vis the current administration and check for their own silence or complicity with this failed China policy. Their role, if any, in the sad history of passive and defeatist deference to this foreign power will be a more reliable gauge of the direction they will take should they take over the presidency. Some have not hidden their close relationship to China and demonstrated their deference to Chinese interests even now. Others are too late the heroes, speaking out only for electoral effect, even if they never said a word before about the West Philippine Sea. And only a couple really have taken serious positions and publicly declared their disagreement with the administration's failed policies and decisions long before this election season. If we care about the West Philippine Sea and the natural resources there that are ours by legal right and entitlement under international law, we cannot elect a president and vice president who will again take a defeatist stance against our increasingly assertive neighbor. Next year, 2022, we're actually likely to see China become even more assertive and insistent about its excessive claims, which brings us to that second challenge, layering the cabbage. By cabbage here, we of course refer to the cabbage strategy, which China continues to employ as a means of establishing de facto control and dominance over the South China Sea, particularly our portion of it, the West Philippine Sea. Last week's incident involving interference with the resupply mission to our outpost on the Sierra Madre is a very, very clear indication that China intends to continue using gray zone operations to squeeze us out of the West Philippine Sea and the Calayan Island Group. Gray zone operations are activities undertaken by China meant to achieve specific objectives, in this case, the acquisition of control and dominance over large areas of the sea, while avoiding the conditions that enable us to take measures for our defense. Okay? They fall just short of being lawfully characterized as acts of aggression or use of force contrary to the United Nations Charter and international law, but effectively enable them to wrest control of land and sea territories. So like guerrilla warfare, they allow China to take away the West Philippine Sea and the Calayan Island Group without firing a single shot. These are part and parcel of the so-called cabbage strategy, by which China seeks to encircle each one of our outposts in the West Philippine Sea with layer upon layer of Chinese influence and control. Our islands are being surrounded by supposedly civilian fishing vessels, but are actually part of their militarily controlled maritime militia. They're backed up by the presence of the China Coast Guard, and thus just on the horizon behind them would be the People's Liberation Army, Navy, and Air Force. By inundating the area with these different agents, these layers of influence and control, China intends to make it increasingly difficult for us to maintain our access to these areas and undertake legitimately, without interference, our own resource activities. So it is expected that China will ramp up other civilian, supposedly civilian activities and exercises of governmental authorities, such as law enforcement operations through the China Coast Guard, marine scientific research by its fleet of instruments and platforms, and resource exploitation, such as fishing operations. and petroleum exploration unilaterally carried out in our continental shelf and EEZ. And of course, the employment of lawfare to undermine our own faith in international law and our own legal position established in the South China Sea arbitration. Against this background, China will continue to expand its military might to ensure military dominance over smaller countries and to challenge external powers, as already also explained by our speakers before me. So they will take advantage of these three large military bases in Fiery Cross, Subi, and Mischief Reef in order to expand their military control. And they will begin expanding to the aerospace arena as well. That's why through the use of hypersonic weapons. And this will create an umbrella force ready to deploy at a moment's notice against any perceived threat to their interests, regardless of the negative impact and collateral damage they may inflict on smaller regional countries like us. So China's plans for acquiring control and dominance with South China Sea is not only designed to be slow and incremental, it can also be rapid and dynamic, taking advantage of opportunities that may arise. So this then brings us to the third challenge, that the year 2022 also happens to be an opportunity for a crisis. With the election will come a power transition, during which it may be difficult for government to respond to crisis on account of uncertainties in decision-making and decision-makers as well. The elections create an opportunity that could be exploited, a time when government and its responses will be slow and uncertain. Historically, tensions in the West Philippine Sea tend to flare up during the summer months before the typhoon season, when all claimants are able to freely and intensively operate at sea. That happens to coincide with the election season. Okay? Last week's incident at Ayungin Shoal demonstrated that China will not lose an opportunity to change the status quo in its favor by cutting off resupply lines to the Sierra Madre. And we also need to remember that in 2016, we also saw that China mobilized its forces to begin reclamation work on Scarborough Shoal to convert it into an artificial island. So again, next year, these two represent potential crisis points that can be instigated to occur during that time of power transition. And we therefore must be prepared for it. Our security forces must be extra vigilant about activities taking place in these areas claimed by China as we run up to that electoral period. And we must coordinate closely with our allies and partners, as already also explained by General Bautista, to ensure that there are no gaps in our maritime domain awareness and that there is a sufficient flow of information and immediate action can be taken to prevent an induced crisis that could result in either the loss of our presence on Second Thomas Shoal or the potential conversion of Scarborough Shoal into an artificial island. If either one of these two things happen, that will represent another major setback and a major loss for us. So these are, I think, are the three major concerns and challenges for the West Philippine Sea that we must attend to in the coming year 2022. They're not meant to be comprehensive or exclusive, but I believe that they will be the most important and will define the course of events for us in the years that follow. So let us think more clearly about how we should respond to these challenges, prepare for them with our own game plans, and together with other pressing issues that confront our country, put our collective minds to it as we move forward to this time of a change in national leadership. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jay, for discussing the international legal order of oceans and the factors that add to the complexity in the international community's upholding of that order, and also for touching on an extra added layer of complexity brought about by the upcoming 2022 elections. Okay, so I'm now formally opening the floor for questions. We've got a couple in our Q&A box, and I do encourage everybody to type in your questions, and we will ask our panelists. While these questions are still coming in, we've had very excellent presentations, and we also have our work cut out for us. There are a couple of recommendations that each of the presenters have identified. Particularly, Richard mentioned the importance of middle powers. Professor De Castro spoke about how we can move towards a limited balancing strategy. General Bautista highlighted the importance of alliances and strategic partnerships, and Jay mentioned to us that we already have existing legal bodies of order on which we can continue to pursue our own interests, entitlements in what is necessarily ours in the West Philippine Sea. If I can be permitted to throw the first question at the panelists, these are really all good recommendations, and this is something that the next administration can pursue. But how likely really can these recommendations be pursued in light of all the complexities, the closer we get to the 2022 elections? Not to mention the increase in information, misinformation, and disinformation campaigns the closer we get to May 2022. So I'd like to know some of your thoughts regarding this, on how we can ensure that these recommendations can actually be carried through by the next administration. And perhaps I can invite Richard to offer his thoughts first.
Sige, Sharman, thank you very much for that very thought-provoking question to kind of awaken us this morning. Mukhang yung mga audience natin hindi pa masyado nag-pitch in pa. So I don't know if that's a good sign or not. I rather hope that that's because comprehensive enough in discussion. Well, I mean, let's just look at how the elections are shaping up in light of developments in Ayungin. Suddenly you have, Lacson coming back from Pag-asa and making all of these tough statements about China. You have Isko Moreno saying he's going to pull off a Jokowi. So, I mean, at Lenny, we know where she stands on this issue, or Calyodi. So with the exception of the one Bong and the two Bong, Bong and Bong, it seems all other candidates are positioning themselves against the status quo, right? It's just a question of layers of assertiveness. And my sense is the same way that we had the jet ski moment speech by President Duterte, which captured the imagination of a lot of people. I always cite that because people say, wala naman pakiang tao sa foreign policy. Well, it depends how you package it. Pag ang pinag-usapan dito China, pag ang pinag-usapan yung ating mangingisda, yung issue ng gut issues, this resonates with the Filipino people. So it's not true na walang pakiang tao sa foreign policy issue. A lot of that us can attest to that based on our own interaction with so-called ordinary people. So my sense is we're going to have a jet ski moment. Let's not forget, Manny Pacquiao declared his independence from President Duterte by raising yung issue ng Whitson Reef earlier this year. So I think the West Philippines issue is going to pop up in the debates. And I think majority of the candidates will openly push for a tougher stance because they sense where the people are going. They're political after all. And my sense is even Bongbong and Bongo at some point will have to promise some adjustments because clearly Duterte's pivot to China has not worked. There's no evidence to suggest it has worked, right? So my sense is public pressure and also growing pressure from abroad around the world and the shortcomings of Duterte could structurally nudge the next administration in the right direction. Kaya sa tingin ko, hindi tayo nagsasayang ng oras dito, no? Dito sa mga sinusulat natin at mga sinasabi natin.
Thanks, Richard. Professor De Castro?
Yes, I totally agree with Richard. It's how we basically incite this discourse. We cannot simply accept the fact that the people do not care about foreign policy. We have to make them care. And it's not only, I would call the intelligentsia, but I think the armed forces and of course the diplomatic corps. People in government should also have a say regarding this matter. No, they cannot take, of course, a position, but they have to tell the public. These are issues that you have to take into account in choosing your president. As mentioned earlier by Richard, that and I also mentioned it, we cannot anymore afford another 6 years of a leader who is of course defeatist and would of course adopt another version of appeasement. So again, we already mentioned who are those inclined to do so. So we have to be very wary. Or a term that's already circulating in the media, the notion of a Manchurian candidate. So aside from listening to what they're saying, we'd also be wary of any Manchurian candidate.
Thank you, sir. Jay?
Yeah, I really don't have much to add to what Richard and Renat have already said. No, but just this. No, it's true. No, I mean, foreign policy, I think, has now become an issue for more people than ever before, and I see it from the fact that more people have been asking for information, for guidance on these issues. Unlike 20 years ago, where this was just a fringe topic with a few eggheads in a room and maybe the AFP or DND, no? We now get requests for webinars and seminars for fishing communities on the coast, from religious organizations, from professional organizations. No, I mean, the diversity of people is such that I believe now that most people in the Philippines actually give this a lot of importance. No, so it's not just Manchurian candidates, because some people might not even understand Manchuria, no, what that means. No, I mean, or they might not have read the novel. No, or they're too young. No, sabihin na natin diretso, mga puppet. No, we need to make our people aware that there are those people, there are puppets running for office, no, and they need to be careful about them. They cannot vote for them because, as we've all said in many different ways, no, the West Philippine Sea, our rights to that will not survive another 6 years of the kind of policies that this administration initiated and used or employed for the last 5.5 years.
Okay, thanks, Jay. We have one question in our Q&A box that I think General Bautista can answer, because that has to do with strategic partnerships. And the question is, now that the Philippines is diversifying its strategic partnerships, what do you think the Philippines can gain from leveraging those partnerships with middle powers such as with Japan or other European countries? Sir Manny, maybe you can weigh in on this.
Thank you. Well, there's a lot to gain by getting into strategic partnerships. As I mentioned earlier, it contributes to the deterrent effect, deterrence against aggression and aggressiveness by China. The fact that other countries are getting involved and are in agreement that the rule of law must prevail is already a form of deterrent. Much more if we get together formally to form partnerships and alliances, that is going to contribute largely to our objective of standing up a credible defense posture for us.
Okay, thank you, Sir Manny. I think we have time for one more question before we move on to the next panel. And I would like to raise the question of Admiral Ong in our Q&A chat box. How do we reconcile the result of the survey that Professor Dindo mentioned earlier with the recent survey of preferred presidential candidates? Where would be the disconnect, do you think?
Oh, can I just pitch in? I mean, I
Sorry.
think the story of our election so far is that policy is not only secondary, it's non-existent as far as the electoral dynamics is concerned. And that's what I hope will change. But I think President Duterte has made that very hard with all his midnight blind items and all of this back and forth. I don't call it plot twist anymore. I call it twisted plot. So hopefully we transition out of this twisted plot dynamics and discuss policies more. So we have at least 3 COMELEC commission debates next year. There are going to be a lot of discussions here and there. So I'm not, so of course, I know what Admiral Ong is implying here, but I'm sure, especially some of the front runner candidates will really come under pressure on this policy issue. Because as President Duterte said, you know, someone who just relies on his father's name to kind of run, you know, that's a kind of a weak leader. So maybe for once you might want to agree with President Duterte on this or that. So I think soon we're going to see more and more pressure, especially on the front runners, to clarify their positions, lalong-lalo na dito sa West Philippines issue, not to mention dealing with the pandemic, with the economy, among other things. So maybe for some, there's some disconnect now, but I think that precisely that perceived disconnect will be the point of attack by other candidates to actually change the dynamics of the election. So that's what I'm saying. This is a very, very fluid situation. Just look at who was the leading candidate back in November 2015 and look at what happened by May of that year. I'm not saying this election will be exactly the same, But I'm saying never underestimate the ability of the Filipino people to change their mind as facts and discourses change on the ground and as dramatic twists come in. So I'm very optimistic things are going to be more and more interesting.
Thanks, Richard. Any last thoughts from Jay, Professor De Castro, and General Bautista, perhaps on this survey in the disconnect?
Yeah, well, for me, I would like Richard. No, I would not see this disconnect as being permanent. No, Filipinos are notoriously very arbitrary and whimsical. No, it's very easy to stir up a mob. No, and with respect to the current situation, no, these numbers and support, no. I mean, let's face it, this is all based on initial impressions, shall we say, to be kind about it. And so that can change, no? And there has rarely really been any connection between the policy positions that the candidate takes and his personality or his appearance or image before the people, no? So hopefully this can start changing, as Richard pointed out. We have to make it, we have to make the people get past that, get past the image, get past the SOCMED campaign, just get past the propaganda and the lies, no? And let them, get them to see the candidates as they really are and make decisions based on what should be good for the country, no? Not for the long term, for the next 6 years, and not what's good for their wallet for the next day or so. Tayong padala sa gasoline tickets or 1,000 peso bills.
Thanks, Jay. Professor De Castro, any last?
I have nothing else to add. They've said everything, and I agree with them.
Thanks, sir. General Bautista?
Yes, I'd just like to emphasize that these issues we're discussing about, these are national interest issues. These are non-partisan issues, and all of us must consider the national security implications, the interest of our nation above everything else, above politics. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our excellent presenters for this first panel. We have a lot of questions still in our Q&A chat box, so I'd like to invite the panelists, if you are staying on for the next panel, and if you are so inclined, please type in some of the answers to those questions so that we can keep the conversations going. So again,
thanks, Charmaine. Thank you very much also for great moderation, and thanks.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jay, Professor De Castro, Richard, and General Bautista. And now let's move on to our next panel on non-traditional and evolving security challenges. Our first presenter for this second panel is Professor Meli Caballero Anthony. She is professor and head of the Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Professor Anthony will present her analysis on the growing importance of non-traditional security in the region and its significance in Philippine foreign and security policy. This is also based in her ADRI special study entitled Non-Traditional Security Threats to Peace and Security in the Indo-Pacific. Ma'am?
Thank you very much, Charmaine, and my thanks to ADRI for the kind invitation to join you in this very interesting webinar. I've been following very closely the discussion this morning. And for a start, I wanted to say that as regards this topic on non-traditional security, that while indeed major power competition, territorial disputes are causing perturbations to regional and national, in fact, global security, this is really not the only thing that matters as far as security challenges are concerned. I'm not sure if this works, but I wanted to share my my screen, and if it doesn't work, let's see. I just want to show one slide where There you go. Oh, sorry. Can you see that? No? Charmaine, can you see that?
Yes, ma'am, we can see your screen po.
Okay, let's see. This one. Right. This is a 2021 global risk report by the World Economic Forum. And if you look at the types of challenges that have been identified in terms of the impact and in terms of likelihood, you could see that on the far right, which is high impact and high probability of happening, you have issues like climate change failure. Climate change failure, you have, sorry, I'm not very, right? Climate change failure, infectious diseases, you have biodiversity loss, human environmental damage, the natural crises, and interstate conflict is right somewhere in the middle. And of course, the thing that we really fear most, which is the weapons of mass destruction, is high impact, very low probability. So let me exit screen. Right, so where are we as far as these challenges are concerned? Well, we are facing two major existential challenges now. We have the COVID-19 pandemic, which so far has registered about 5 million deaths globally, about 100 million cases. And we see that every day. I mean, I wish very much, I'm always waiting for announcements for, travel lanes to from Singapore to the Philippines, relaxation of restrictions, etc. But it tells you the impact that this pandemic has had on our lives, real impact. The other existential threat really is the climate change that is ongoing. And in fact, we have already, as far as the UN Anthropocene report for this year has warned us, we are already reaching what they call code red of humanity, because the current goal of a 1.5 degrees centigrade is really far beyond our reach. And what happened at the most recent COP 26 in Glasgow has seen how, despite all the talk and the rhetoric, there's really less action in trying to do two things. Mitigating the impact of climate change, that's the agenda, and of course the adaptation. So the argument that I want to present in the time allotted to me is that, we are facing, both the Philippines and the regional and global environment, really serious non-traditional security challenges. And why are they non-traditional? Well, the characteristics are that they are not military in nature, but the impact of these challenges, although they're not military, are in fact devastating and affecting millions of people within a country and across, especially when it comes to facing things like the devastating impact of climate change. And that also they cause instability. We just listened or heard about, why is it very important to protect the maritime commons? And the reason for that is because it's also a major source of food security. So these issues therefore require equally urgent attention apart from the so-called traditional challenges that we face, which is of course the territorial disputes with a particular neighbor. But the approach to dealing with this non-traditional security challenges is not just military in nature, but requires a large swath of comprehensive approaches, which are multi-sectoral, whole of government, and participatory across the board, right? You need a private sector, you need participation from these epistemic communities, experts, civil society groups, and many others. And I think if you are talking about crafting a set of political and security or foreign policy policies, a set of policies moving forward, the other secondary argument is that one, the Philippines therefore should actively not just address this at the national level, but more importantly, because this is a conference on multilateralism, engage like-minded countries who share the same concerns and who share the same challenges. So with that as a, having set that argument forward, let me just focus on a few selected, what I call non-traditional security challenges, and see how much really this has had an impact in the region, because that's really my main focus of interest, but also also including the Philippines, which is of course part of this region. Now, what about climate change? I mean, we hear so much about it. As I said earlier on, we just had this big jamboree in Glasgow. And the sad part about this is, in spite of really all the rhetoric and the challenges, there's really little action that has happened as far as climate change is concerned. One of that is how you actually come up with the right financing to deal with the mitigation challenge, help countries actually transition from coal, high usage of fossil fuels, to low carbon emissions and low carbon technology, and at the same time help the people that have been badly affected by the impact of climate change, whether as a result of extreme weather events or trying to build back or recover better. So if you look at it from the perspective of why is this important, right? I mean, we have numbers to show for it, just in terms of its impact. And one that's most visible, and we feel it, is really the frequency of what we call extreme weather events. The ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance, which is of course the center that monitors the coordination of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief in Southeast Asia, has come up with very interesting figures. And what does it say? Just from 2012 alone, since 2012, the region has already seen, region means Southeast Asia, 2,260 disaster events, including, of course, the tsunami in Indonesia, Typhoon Haiyan in 2013, and Typhoon Damri also in Indonesia. And what the thing with this disasters is not only have they been so devastating, but the human toll has really also been very high. You're talking about millions of people that have been displaced. And when you talk about dollars and cents, you're looking at, as far as Typhoon Haiyan, for example, has shown, it basically cost the Philippine economy to the tune of $10 billion in losses and damages. The other interesting thing about the kind of disasters, natural disasters. Now, if you were a meteorologist, you don't talk about natural disasters. Disasters are not natural, right? Because most of this, the damage really is also impacted, influenced by the way we have dealt. We have dealt with the environment and the fact that we have not been prepared for it. But as I said, compounding these ever-changing challenges is really the fact that the nature, the frequency and the intensity of these disasters are deviating from what we call the usual patterns, affecting areas with no historical precedent of floods and cyclones. I mean, you have parts of the Philippines that are usually, don't experience cyclones, but are now experiencing that. And it shows you the changing patterns. And that is really something that's even more worrying. What does it mean as far as adaptation is concerned? One is that it costs, of course, a lot of money. But so you have at the same time trying to lower down your greenhouse gas emissions, and it's very difficult because some economies we have traditionally relied on fossil fuels, and we need to run the economy. At the same time, you're under pressure globally to make sure that you reduce that. For your mitigation targets, you have met them, and the other side is, of course, the adaptation challenges. And adaptation really is, how do you protect people from the impact of climate change, right? When it comes to physical security, that you're able to immediately have the right, if you talk about rapid deployment of troops in military conflict, you also need to have rapid deployment of people that can actually lend humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. So in many vulnerable countries in the region, including, of course, the Philippines, climate change should, and the call, therefore, is that it should be one of the top, it should be included in one of the, I think, the top 3 security challenges that we should not take our eyes off. In disaster-prone countries like the Philippines, in the disaster map in the Asean region, the top 3 really is Myanmar, Philippines, and Thailand, which are seen to be the most risk when it comes to climate change. And this has been shown over the last 2 decades, and it could only get worse. The important thing about climate change, too, is really its impact, not just on extreme weather events, but really on the agricultural sector for many developing countries. And when you are a country that is not food secure, a point that I will come back in a while, paying attention to ensure that the agriculture is climate smart or climate ready is something that should be given attention to, because when people are food insecure, as what we have seen in other parts of the world, right, you can be militarily prepared, but when it comes to food crisis that's happening and in acute sense, then you could actually see governments being toppled, as we have seen in the Arab world. The second, and I think which is most important, is something that we are already experiencing, and this is the impact of outbreaks of pandemics. It is once described as an extraordinary once-in-a-century pandemic, really because while we had SARS in 2003, it was only for a few months, but this one is a long-drawn pandemic. And in some parts of the world, you're still seeing the concern that you're still maybe coming and having to face the 4th wave of COVID-19. And it could, in fact, even permutate into another type of variant of COVID-19. When you talk about clear and present danger, we always talk about missiles, hypersonic missiles, nuclear missiles that are coming, and we really have to be very careful about that. When we talk about clear and present danger for everyday people, for everyday lives, I mean, you're talking really about the impact of climate change, not just to physical health, but to the economic security of people. There have already been, right, a massive economic displacement as a result of the pandemic, because we have closed down the borders. And when it talks about numbers, we were talking about a global economic contraction last year of up to 8 to 10%, and sometimes even negative GDP growth in Southeast Asia. The Philippines, as we all know, has been badly affected. And while the Philippines is in fact seeing a gradual improvement in its numbers, we are still not sure whether we're out of the woods yet. I follow the Twitter of the Ministry of Department of Health, and it always asks us to be careful and not to take things for granted. But the severe consequences of pandemic outbreaks, we are told by the World Health Organization that this is not going to be the last pandemic that we're going to see, right? I mean, in light of a highly interconnected global environment, and with travel, hopefully that is going to be resumed. And, the way the environment has evolved in security studies, we have gone beyond the 3 isms, realism, constructivism, and liberalism, in looking at security and its impact on international relations. Nowadays, the talk is about the age of the Anthropocene and the risk of the Anthropocene. And when you actually break it down in concrete terms, you're looking at job losses to a high of 80 million across the Asia Pacific. A figure that does not include the millions more that have been lost in the informal economy. Global poverty has rose significantly, with 150 million more people falling below the poverty line or entering extreme poverty. There's also economic induced food insecurity, with another 100 million people becoming undernourished, right? And I mean, you can add on all these layers of real security challenges, affecting the lives and security of peoples and states. And the question is, to what extent have regions actually been able to be prepared in the first place and to deal with it? And not just nation states, but how have regions and the global world has actually dealt with it? One of the failures of global health governance has been leadership. And we saw that, in light of maybe the slowness of the World Health Organization to declare COVID-19 as a pandemic. There was also the disquiet with the way, major powers have dealt with it. The US was lacking. I mean, this was, of course, in the previous administration, was downplaying the nature of the crises. It was attacking the World Health Organization that we relied on so much for technical help. And even China, who had, of course, been promising vaccines as a global good, and what for a while actually was enjoying that kind of, vaccine diplomacy, the first mover in vaccine diplomacy, right, is now, of course, now also being tested as far as pandemic preparedness and response is concerned. So these two existential challenges that is very visible and that's very real is, I think, something that the current, we call it the 21st century challenges, must really be front and center of any security policy and foreign policy of states in the region and, of course, globally. I mentioned about the impact of climate change on food security, and I'm glad that we talked about the need actually to also protect the maritime commons. And this is where I think it is important, and this is where non-traditional security and security challenges really converge, because marine sustainability, as far as food security is concerned, is very, very important, because there's life underwater and there's food underwater. To find a suitable path to food security, therefore, it is incumbent upon maritime states, including the Philippines, to maintain a good integrated coastal management, ensuring that illegal and unregulated and unreported fishing is actually stopped. And how do you do that? There's a lot of mechanisms that is being undertaken. It's good to learn from the lessons in our neighbors in Indonesia and how actually they have sort of tried to put a stop in IUU, and how effective data sharing is very, very important within and between states. I mean, these are just a few of the major non-traditional security challenges that's so real in our region. So if I want to sort of then say, so how do you then move this forward? I have talked about the need to put this front and center in the security agenda of states and in the foreign policy agenda of states. And certainly, if you were to then say that, how do you deal with this at the national level? And I don't pretend to be an expert in Philippine foreign and security policy, but I have sort of jotted down a few things that I think worth considering. In terms of dealing with the complex issue of climate change, for example, it is important, I think, for the government, right, or governments to set out key policy priorities to address the multifaceted consequences of climate change. It is important, I talked about the need to strengthen adaptive capacity in dealing with its direct impact through enhanced disaster preparedness and response mechanism, and at the same time having coherent frameworks. Now, in this case, the Philippines, in fact, is becoming a point of reference as far as mechanisms are concerned. But these are mechanisms that if the question is the extent to which these mechanisms are actually effective and its ability to actually address the whole slew of extant challenges that's related to climate change, including, of course, disaster relief. And where it bears, therefore, considering perhaps establishing a specialized climate security agency. Nowadays, even the militaries in the region, there is an organization that looks at militaries that deals with climate change. And it's a lot of discourse of climate and security for the very reason that climate change is known to be also a driver of conflict. It can aggravate existing conflict, interstate conflict. It can aggravate discontent among people. It can aggravate real security challenges in terms of lives. And at the same time, it can aggravate people's discontent with their own states, with their own governments, if the governments are not able to deal with these challenges effectively. And perhaps what's worth mentioning and considering is having a climate change security advisor that is able to develop a targeted, coherent strategy and create, if we talk about multi-sectoral and multi-agency synergy, then that is the role that a climate security agency perhaps is necessary. I'm not sure whether this is already happening in the Philippines, but our major agenda, not just in many countries in the region, for example, you're looking at Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and others, is now the need to have a comprehensive risk assessment and management strategy, which must be done regularly so that national policies can be crafted and they're timely and to deal with major challenges. Monitoring capacities must be strengthened at the local and regional levels so that when it comes to policy coherence between the local and the national, then you don't have these gaps, right? This expectation that the local government should have done that rather than relying solely on national efforts. So developing mechanisms at the sub-regional level is very important in being able to have a comprehensive or developing risk profiles and capacities, right? For regions that do not have, no history of natural disasters, perhaps it is useful to think about risk assessments and to see to what extent this risk really should be included in the risk assessment. Financing and resource mobilization is very important. It must be developed to address a range of non-traditional security challenges. And this is where, when you talk about, it's where it sits in the agenda of multilateralism in the region, you must be able to harness, resources from bilateral partners, international institutions, of course, like the Asian Development Bank. I think in the case of the Philippines for climate change and pandemics, it's already there. But there are other international institutions that perhaps the engagement can be improved further, as well as engage the private sector. These strategies needs to be streamlined to avoid duplication and wastage. A favorite topic of mine is, of course, addressing the weak link in pandemic preparedness. Now, as far as dealing with, we call it the surge capacity of health, of the public health sector, it's been known that, you can talk about vaccines and the problem with addressing with, the issue of vaccine equity, etc. But if you don't have strong public health systems that can provide primary health care, there are a lot of reports now that show that together with looking at vaccine equity, improving capabilities in therapeutics, manufacturing, etc., you need to be able to bolster that the health systems at the national and local level so that when surge happens, the surge capacity is there. So this is all part of the pandemic preparedness plan to prevent, to detect, and to respond to outbreaks of pandemic. Now, preparedness is very important also when you talk about food security. Food resilient systems are needed to ensure that when there is a huge and massive disruption as a result of pandemics, when movements are controlled or are stopped, right, you can what we call pandemic proof your food systems. So it is important to be, to be mindful of what are the possible disruptions out there, as a result of a changing climate, as a result of a health, the health of the planet. A buzzword that's also very that's out there now is maintaining planetary health. I think we have scholars in the Philippines that are looking at that and pushing the thought that it's no longer just us, a state vis-a-vis another state. It's no longer just individuals vis-a-vis, the state. It is now a tripod. You have people, you have states, and you have the environment. So when you want to have security in the longer run, right, when you talk about hybrid threats that could result, right, as an outbreak of pandemics, and then this can be used, for example, for malicious purposes, and hence biosecurity has a different dimension altogether. You must be mindful of being able to anticipate preparedness in looking at the kind of threats that are out there. And finally, let me talk about what more can countries in Southeast Asia can really do in addressing shared common challenges, which are so-called non-traditional. And that is where collaboration and partnership must be very stressed and underlined, because when it comes to this kind of challenges, capacity building is most important. There must be development, joint development in research, in sharing of technology, right? And when it comes to emerging diseases, there must be deep collaboration among scientists in this region. Even when it comes to manufacturing of vaccines, we are seeing that slowly, that's happening. Countries in the region like Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand, and hopefully the Philippines will be able to manufacture vaccines, but that requires partnership when it comes to either, the relaxation of patents, and at the same time, the sharing of technology, even down to sharing of information when it comes to, as I said, risk profiling, and with also information when it comes to how activities in the maritime domain are actually taking place. This goes a long way in ensuring preparedness to deal with these emerging challenges. And last but not least, countries should actively support and participate in multilateral frameworks. We have ASEAN. We have ASEAN +3, we have the East Asia Summit, and there was mention about multilaterals like the Quad and AUKUS. I won't talk so much about AUKUS because really AUKUS is more, I call it an Anglosphere kind of arrangements, and it's more focused on developing really nuclear submarines, propulsion technology. But even for Quad, there are working groups that looks at pandemics. There's a promise, for example, of the Quad countries, the US, India, Australia, and Japan, to be able to deliver a billion doses of vaccines by 2022. And these 4 countries are very critical because when you talk about India, it's the biggest vaccine manufacturer around the world. You have the US and again, that has the technology to do that. Of course, India also has. And you can look at Japan for financing, and you also have Australia to what they call, that can actually undertake what they call the last mile delivery of the vaccines. So even this Quad, which is seen to be, by certain countries as highly exclusive, there's no reason why the Philippines cannot actively engage with countries in the Quad, because it has an alliance arrangements with the US, which is a major player in the Quad. It has all this defense and security cooperation with Japan, Australia. So there are this. So in other words, all these multilateral security arrangements that are out there are also useful channels and frameworks to tap if the Philippines and other countries are to be prepared and to be able to address, right, the kinds of non-traditional security challenges facing us today. So I'll leave it at that, and I welcome questions at the end of this, this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for discussing and telling us that we can't and shouldn't take our eyes off non-traditional issues, but also that we need to be cognizant that often the measures that we rely on to address these challenges are still state-based and highly militarized, and that we should really move away from those types of responses. So let's now move on to our next speaker. Dr. Alma Salvador is the co-convener of the Department of Political Science Working Group on Security Sector Reform. She's also associate professor at the Ateneo de Manila University. Dr. Salvador will share her insights on ASEAN's response to the emergence of non-traditional security threats in the region. In addition, she will also discuss the importance of establishing a regional mechanism to collectively manage risks in Southeast Asia. Dr. Salvador, please.
Thank you, Charmaine. Hello, everyone. My name is Alma Salvador from the Department of Political Science of Ateneo de Manila. I shall share screen for my presentation that's entitled Beyond Maritime Disputes, ASEAN's Response to Non-Traditional Security Threats and National Regional Policy Convergence. First of all, I'd like to thank the Albert Del Rosario Institute for this opportunity to engage the public on questions of non-traditional security threats. And I very much resonate the points that have been raised by our colleagues in the first panel, as well as the immediate presentation of our esteemed professor from RSIS, Professor Melly Caballero Anthony. So in forwarding my presentation, I'd like to begin with the conceptual framework. I've used this concept of securitization in order to highlight my point in advancing a more convergent national, regional, and a foreign and security policy that incorporates and integrates national non-traditional security threats in most of my presentation and most of my work. And I'd like to highlight specific elements that make up this idea of securitization that stretches its notion away from the idea that securitization is only a declaration of state of emergency on aspects of public policy towards the realm of national security. Although this framework does not negate that idea of what securitization can be by highlighting certain ideas. Number one is the idea of communities of security practice, in which I argue that there exists an evolving and at the same time a robust communities of security practice in the Southeast Asian region, in which ASEAN member states are a part of, specifically in the areas of maritime security defined and practiced in terms of social security, HADR, counterterrorism, and maritime incident prevention. When I say some of these communities of security practice are evolving, I note that if you imagine, and some are more robust, I note that if you are to visualize it in the context of a continuum, on the left side or in the incipient side of a continuum, you would see that some of these practices are more discursive in orientation, meaning that declarations, and at the far end are more robust institutions where enforcement is highly evident and operationalized. Somewhere in the middle is what I'd like to highlight in the first segment of my presentation, where practical cooperation takes place. Practical cooperation, of course, if we build on practical cooperation, this eventually would lead to a greater institutions building that are more embedded and that are more firmly ingrained in terms of governance. I borrow from the work of Christian Bueger, the notion of community practice, which he defines as shared understanding of what constitutes an existential threat or not. And then, of course, when we say securitization, this refers to the process of being able to determine which issues are considered to be existentially threatening to us. And as I've said, I have, in the work of Christian Bueger, the notion of securitization is broadened enough to include practices that are not, or the process by which certain practices are not necessarily just, have not evolved primarily because it's an emergency response, but they have evolved practically because they have, they are operationalized in a given context. I also highlight the definition based on practice, which would include tools, institutions, and institutions building. When I say tools, we look into databases, codes of language, such as, for instance, the code of unplanned encounters and maritime incidents, and that has been developed sometime in 2014 in a symposium of Western Pacific nations, and has been recently adopted in the context of the ASEAN-China joint maritime exercises. Security actors are definitely those actors that are engaged in building the communities of security practice. And here I borrow from the work of Professor Melly in terms of defining what actors are. Actors, of course, are your agenda setters, but more importantly, they participate in the governance process. If governance structures have been made embedded or have been made available. Of course, this framework I try to relate to this whole idea of what constitutes the non-traditional security threats in the region and the extent to which ASEAN and our dialogue partners have responded to this. And I also want to highlight that the maritime security domain is basically a confluence of those practices that are evolving and that are embedded or highly institutionalized, and that if we compare them to the institutions and the security framework that have evolved in the area or in the security areas or security issue areas of infectious diseases, HADR, for instance, we would find some comparison and would allow us to distinguish between what makes an issue area in terms of institutions as robust or not. And this is because there are levels of complexity involved in evolving institutions building responses. Okay, so just very quickly, when we speak of robust institutions building, this is something that we can take into consideration. That in the area, for instance, of infectious diseases, we try to look into the evolution of institutions in the Southeast Asian region from the time when ASEAN member states have responded in 2003 at the outbreak of SARS to the period when we have now, as a collective, responded, although not perfectly, to the challenges of COVID-19. So you can see here in this screen the institutional framework that is being made available as a result of national regional interaction. Of course, this also applies to HADR, and the sample of the institutional framework is as well being presented here. Now, my context is in the pandemic world. China's aggression is becoming more evident than ever, and there's no major progress in the Code of Conduct discussions. And in fact, in the 2018 single text negotiating draft of the Code of Conduct, the following elements have not been included or have not been defined. Number one is that the absence of a geographical scope, insofar as what constitutes the scope of or the geographical scope to which the Code of Conduct will apply. There's no specific provision or agreed upon a provision on the enforcement and on conflict settlement, and of course it does not recognize the arbitral ruling. Needless to say, we are also confronted with the most recent event at the Ayungin Shoal. My arguments for this presentation is basically revolve around what we need, what the next presidential administration may take into consideration, and they basically resonate with some of the points raised by our colleagues in the first panel. The number one of which is enhanced policy convergence in terms of our foreign and security policies that would reflect the directions and the prioritization and the movements that are taking place at the national, regional, maritime securitization. And this is basically how I would like to proceed in this presentation. The following arguments are, number one is that we should take the opportunity that is available in the region, take advantage of the duty to cooperate provision in the UNCLOS, and which is also included in the ongoing discussion of the Code of Conduct, or at least in the latest draft of the Code of Conduct, and embark on practical cooperation as this strengthens ASEAN centrality. Second argument is that practical cooperation addresses the confluence of traditional and non-traditional security issues in the South China Sea specifically. In the South China Sea, or needless to say, some of the non-traditional security threats, for instance, such as IUU and illegal fishing, are very much intertwined with territorial incursions and the gray zone taxes that are being applied by China. So unlike other security domains, the maritime security domain is a little bit more challenging and problematic because of the conflation of non-traditional with traditional security issues. In relation to what I've said, practical cooperation is with the members of ASEAN, either as a whole or at the sub-regional level, builds national capability, specifically in maritime security issue, in the area of maritime domain awareness. And in the course of my presentation, I highlight and focus on the importance of being able to look into that, to look into how we can further develop our capabilities on MDA or maritime domain awareness by revisiting our alliance, for instance, with the United States in the same context as has been raised by our colleague General Manny Bautista, in looking at or in recontextualizing our alliance and revisiting our own set of responsibilities. So if we are to become a responsible partner of the United States in the context of the US-Philippine alliance, there is a need for us to develop our own MDA, and this we can do by investing on it through our strategic partnerships, but in addition to that, through our defense modernization thrust that converges with our foreign policy and security policies. And in my third argument, I also proffer this idea that it is by building our relationship in the context of this practical cooperation, specifically in maritime security and MDA capacity building and capability building, that we are able to operationalize our claim to put forward the arbitral ruling. And then number 4, and this is where I make some recommendation in the context of the new administration, something that they have to take into consideration in terms of converging our foreign and security policies that would reflect the directions that are taking place in the context of national and regional security vision. Okay, so on my first and second arguments, this is what I'd like to highlight. I'd like, on your screen, you will see that here I attempted presenting the levels in communities of maritime security practice. And you will see that in terms of levels, these are overlapping communities of maritime security practices in Southeast Asia alone. And these are dominated by the institutions that have been developed or are evolving in the context of, number 1, ASEAN-led regional interaction, specifically led by ADMM and ADMM+. And here I try to differentiate the institutions that have evolved in the context of the security platform of ADMM through its EWG, and those that have evolved in the security platforms of ARF, ISM, AMF, or the ASEAN Maritime Security and the East Asia Summit, to say that it is the practical cooperation elements of our cooperation in the context of ADMM and ADMM+ that is considered to be promising in terms of building on practical cooperation and at the sub-regional or at the regional level, and in terms of forging strategic partnership. And this is something that we could look into or the next administration can look into, and how we can further develop a practical cooperation that is already being embedded in SAR or search and rescue, HADR, counterterrorism, and incident prevention. I'd also like to highlight, for instance, that the joint maritime security exercises between ASEAN and China that has taken place or have taken place in Singapore in 2018 is one such example of this kind of practical cooperation that distinguishes itself as robust and promising, as opposed to the institutions building at the discursive level that are evolving or have evolved in the platforms of the ASEAN Regional Forum, ASEAN Maritime Forum, and East Asia Summit, which have also focused on the non-traditional security threats of maritime domain awareness, anti-piracy, marine environmental protection, fisheries management, disaster response, search and rescue, and sea lane communication. At the next level, in terms of the existing or what exists, existing communities of maritime security practice are our practical cooperation with extra-regional partners. So imagine the overlapping institutions and the practices that are taking place simultaneously with ASEAN-led interaction are our practical cooperation with extra-regional partners, such in the context, for instance, of CARAT and CCAT exercises. Another example is inter-regional cooperation. This is, I would say, these are not necessarily robust and maybe characterized as not necessarily robust and needs a lot. We need to pay attention in this, and this is something that we need to take into consideration, or the next presidential administration should take into consideration if we are to rethink the directions of our foreign policy, if we have to advance our claim in arbitral ruling, if we have to address the non-traditional security challenges in the South China Sea, is to strengthen our sub-regional partnerships, those that exist and those that are currently at work, such as, for instance, the ones that we have in the trilateral patrol cooperation we have in Indonesia and Malaysia. Once we are able to develop this, a focus on this will eventually contribute to the development of our monitoring, control, and surveillance capabilities in the aspect of maritime domain, which is something that we can advance insofar as trying to build a capability against illegal fishing and IUU fishing. My third argument is based on the idea that we should build on or thicken our participation and our engagement. So we are already participating and very much engaged, specifically in this maritime security body. And the next administration should invest on these engagements in terms of assets and human resource and capability development, and in terms of choosing the focus and the locus of our strategic partnership. So it is in this aspect that we should refocus our strategic partnerships. Our strategic partnership should be based on a recasted type of partnership that is anchored on addressing non-traditional security issues, such as, for instance, climate-induced IUU, marine environmental degradation, in addition to piracy, for instance. And of course, needless to say, these non-traditional security threats are very much intertwined with territorial sovereignty and sovereignty issues. So here I show you that in the Southeast Asia, it's an institutional arrangement in which there are operational multinational fusion centers, which are very much engaged in information fusion. The Singapore-based Information Fusion Center, in which our representation is anchored on the participation and representation of the National Coast Watch. The Coast Guard's participation, for instance, is a focal point in RECAP, which is engaged in information sharing in the aspects of anti-piracy. The IFC, by the way, is engaged in information fusion insofar as piracy and in addition to piracy maritime incidents. And of course, the Kuala Lumpur-based IMBPRC, which is focused on information reporting, and it's largely focused on the private sector, particularly the shipping industry is also focused on anti-piracy. So the proposal here is for the next administration to pivot its investments and prioritization in terms of deeper engagement of this sector of our national security in order for us to build capacity in maritime domain. Then my third argument specifically looks into how we can extend this kind of cooperation and capability in maritime domain awareness from anti-piracy. Because you could see these bodies are largely focused on anti-piracy, except for IFC, or the Information Fusion Center is also largely concerned with other maritime incidents. And I think that if we are to rethink and reorient our alliances and our strategic partnerships in order for us to be more responsive, in order for government to be responsive to an altered geopolitical context, highlighting, for instance, the two existential threats that Professor Melly has shared with us, but a new infectious diseases that might eventually change or assume the form of a pandemic, and climate change. We need to invest or to focus our capacity building efforts on maritime domain awareness so that we can address the issues of climate change, IUU, and illegal fishing and marine degradation. Here, this is only to show you that these are some of the efforts and initiatives that have been put in place as a result of our relationship with CSEC. Now, part of the in order to concretize this, there's really a need to have some kind of national regional conversation and convergence, because in the absence of a regional fisheries management organization, which is already occupying the discourse and conversations on how we can look into how we can address the illegal fishing and climate change induced marine degradation in the South China Sea. National and regional conversation and policy convergences should take place in order for us to look into how we can reduce fishing capacity, strengthen national legislation in order to make this happen, look into technical issues such as looking into fishing licensing, fishing vessels registration. The most recent article published by or written by Gregory Paulington, CSIS, have noted that we remain to be sea blinded in ASEAN compared to our counterparts in ASEAN. We are one of those who are which is sea blind, and as a result of mainly as a result of the lack of policy convergence in the aspect of, for instance, one of many things is our inability to install a vessel monitoring system, which would require coordination between our agencies, the BIFAR or the Bureau of Fisheries and Bureau of Fisheries Administration, Coast Watch, and the Philippine Navy. Having said that, this is my last slide. Having said that, what we need, I think, or what the next presidential administration should focus on is an enhanced policy convergence in foreign and national security policy domains that would reflect the regional securitization in maritime security. I also like to say that there is a need for us to integrate the following elements in the national security policy and strategy formulation for the next presidential administration. The following elements have appeared in and the national security policy of the previous administration. And I'd like to highlight the following. The Philippines is an Asean nation. Recognition of the issues of West Philippine Sea. Recognition of non-traditional security as strategic issues. For instance, transnational crimes, climate change, IUU and illegal fishing, climate change-induced environmental degradation, disasters and health, defense modernization, specifically the enhancement of surveillance, deterrence, and border patrol capabilities of the Philippine Navy, PCG, and Philippine Armed Force. And here I resonate one of the recommendations of our colleague, Professor Renata de Castro, that we cannot stay at the level of internal security operations and counterterrorism and illegal drug trafficking alone. And of course, the promotion of strategic partnerships around maritime security, particularly in the area of MDA and maritime domain awareness. On that note, I end my presentation on the response at the national and regional level and to non-traditional security threats in the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Salvador, for highlighting the many arrangements within ASEAN that the Philippines can definitely take advantage of, right? We have two more presentations for this panel, and I find it really interesting that we have a lot of things to talk about. So we will extend a little bit because of the many things that we are discussing. Our next presentation will be by Dr. Deo Florence Onda. He's Associate Professor and Deputy Director for Research at the UP Marine Science Institute. Deo will speak about his insights on the consequences of China's incursions on the country's marine environment. He will also share his recommendations to preserve and protect the country's marine resources while ensuring peace and stability in the disputed waters. Deo, if you're ready.
Yes, good morning, everyone, and thank you for that very generous introduction. And I'd like to thank again the ADRI and StratBase for the invitation and the opportunity to provide some insights. I'm always happy to, sort of mix the or contribute some scientific perspectives or nexus of it to the geopolitical situation, especially in the West Philippine Sea. So my task today is just really to give an overview of the implications of the activities of China's non-traditional security threats in the environments that we have in the West Philippine Sea and largely for the South China Sea. So the thing is that in the past years, I think many of the activities of China have been well documented, especially those that I classify as the continuing non-traditional threats. This include overfishing, the illegal fishing, poaching, harvesting of clam, corals, which lead then to habitat change and habitat destruction. However, in the recent years or in the recent decade, we've also seen the emergence of new and emerging threats or non-traditional security threats, which include the artificial island building, which directly destroys the ecosystems in the West Philippine Sea in the Spratlys Island group. And then in the past year, we've been bombarded with this satellite imagery of ocean-based water pollution, such as the sewage disposal from the many vessels that are stationed in the West Philippine Sea. We also are now seeing a surge in the evidence of the extent and gravity of ocean-based plastics pollution in the region. And then you have this I call the illegal MSR, illegal marine scientific research activities. I classify this as an activity that results into more damages, primarily because it limits our understanding on the possible implications of climate change, and therefore also limits our capability to mitigate and adapt to these changes. I think it is not a secret anymore on the continuing threats that are being imposed to the different environments of the West Philippine Sea because of the activities of China, such as poaching and illegal harvesting, overfishing, illegal practices, as well as artificial island building. These activities result in dwindling fishery stocks, which are predicted to cause collapse in the fisheries, not only of the Philippines, but of the entire South China Sea basin. And because also of habitat destructions, the island building that would decimate the entire ecosystem would then lead to non-availability of structures where organisms can live, thrive, and then reproduce. These activities, although they're happening separately in the different parts of the South China Sea, is very important because we need to look at we need to understand that the ecosystem in the South China Sea is one big ecosystem. One reef is not separated from another. It is not isolated. All of these reefs are interconnected, and several studies have already shown that the offshore environments in the West Philippine Sea, for example, the ones that we find in the Spratlys Island groups, are actually important sources of larvae. And these larvae drift, get transported by the current, which then get deposited in the many coastal areas of the littoral states around the South China Sea. Therefore, the offshore environments actually serve as seed banks for many of the organisms or fisheries with high economic value that we benefit from when they reach the coast of the different countries. So anything that is happening in the middle of the South China Sea will always have an implication and effect on the fisheries and productivity of the coastal environments of the different nations. Now, coming from the continuing non-traditional threats, which have been, you know, comprehensively studied in the recent years and are being continually investigated until now, we move on to the new and emerging non-traditional threats in the West Philippine Sea or the South China Sea. So earlier this year, we've been shown these images of satellite-based imaging or satellite-derived images of ships with algal bloom trails, suggesting that the release of sewage would then fuel blooms of algae. I think if we are to interpret this such activities, we need to be aware that sewage dumping itself is a common practice, but subjected to the guidelines by IMO. It is not an isolated case on the ships that we've seen or vessels of China that are stationed in the West Philippine Sea. However, there is a big difference between pulses versus sustained. When we look at pulses or the irregular dumping, this have been considered, at least in the scientific community, to have minimal effects, primarily because there is a recognition that the ocean has such high tolerance for certain pollution and it has its own capacity to recuperate. Therefore, pulses would have minimal effects on the ecosystems, primarily because of the tolerance range of the ocean in its ecological service in absorbing these pollutants. However, it is a different scenario when we start talking about sustained and long-term sewage disposal. In the West Philippine Sea or in the Kalayaan Island group, where many of the vessels are stationed for so many months or even years, many of these vessels won't have the capacity to, accumulate and then accumulate the sewage before returning to the shore. Many of them will actually dispose this in the environments around the West Philippine Sea, and that sustained disposal of the sewage, as well as the proximity of these vessels to the many habitats, will have an effect, a significant effect to the local environment. Why is untreated sewage actually hazardous or considered dangerous? Because many of this, especially untreated, will contain pathogenic bacteria. And these pathogenic bacteria, although they are not harmful to humans, they can be harmful to other organisms and can cause diseases in corals and in fishes. A lot of studies have also shown that sewages contain high concentrations of antibiotic-resistant genes and then promoting diseases to many ecosystems. They also have high levels of organic matter. And high organic matter would mean high decomposition rate, and high decomposition would lead to consumption of the dissolved oxygen, creating mini dead zones. And these dead zones are basically deserts of the sea. No animal can actually live in these dead zones. And the more you accumulate sewage or the more you dump more organic matter, there's a higher likelihood that you create these mini dead zones. And of course, there is the presence of other persistent organic pollutants. Now, if sustained and disposed near habitat, this untreated sewage may actually pose damage to immediate ecosystems, especially the vulnerable ecosystems in the West Philippine Sea. The other emerging threat now in the West Philippine Sea are the plastics. We know the Philippines has been tagged as the third or fifth largest contributor to marine plastics pollution. And we have seen in the many expeditions that we've done in the Kalayaan Island group in the South China Sea, we've seen that even isolated places or uninhabited islands actually have high accumulations of plastics. We've seen this in Pag-asa Island, we've seen this in Kota, we've seen this in Lawak, we've seen this in the Taiping or Ituaba, now occupied by China, by Taiwan. And just recently, in the past expedition, this May 2021, this was the scenario that we seen in Pag-asa Island. And Pag-asa Island only has 100 or 200 inhabitants, and many of them, and they don't produce that much waste. But this is the scenario, this is the kind of environment that you will observe in the coast of Pag-asa Island. And if you look back into the possible origin of this waste, at least on the products that still have labels on them, surveys that we did show that around 60% of the trash or plastics that you see in Pag-asa actually come from different countries. They are not local, they're not Philippine made, but rather coming from the different parts of the South China Sea, including Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, Singapore, mainland China, Taiwan, and of course, the Philippines. So this just shows us that the problem in the South China Sea is that the plastics problem is a transnational boundary problem. And specific to China, this is problematic because global studies show that the plastics that you see in the oceans, 80% of that, yes, might be coming from land, but 20% of that is coming from the ocean-based sources, including ships, including fisheries vessels, including cruise liners, including cargo ships. And the more vessels that are staying for longer period of time in the sea without proper waste management system, there is also a higher likelihood of the trash actually being dumped into the ocean. And these are some of the evidence that we've gathered. There is still no comprehensive study on the sightings, the volume, the number of collected materials that are similar to this. For example, these are trash bags that the fisher folks of Pag-asa have been periodically collecting in the middle of the lagoon of Pag-asa. And these are new trash, meaning they have not drifted for a long time in the sea. There is no evidence of biofilm formation, suggesting that these are actually new trash. And we do not know how much of this is really, being dumped into the ocean, how frequent they are seen, but it is possible many of the vessels in the South China Sea or in the Spratlys, because they've been staying there for a long time already. Many of the trash that they're producing are also being dumped into the ocean, and that contributes to the problem on the environments of the West Philippine Sea. It is not only that. Many of the trash do not stay afloat. If you dive, we've done a lot of dives in the different features of the Kalayaan Island group in the West Philippine Sea. We've seen a lot of ghost nets or discarded fishing gears. And the more fisheries vessels you have and the more fishing activities you have, there's also higher likelihood of many ghost nets being trapped or being deposited in the different reefs or environments of the Kalayaan or Spratlys Island group. So these are actually direct threats. It is very abstract to many, but if you look at the effect of one trash killing one coral, and it is happening at high, it is happening in an imaginative scale, then this trash will eventually decimate an entire reef ecosystem and then affect the connectivity of the region, affect the fisheries production of the area. So it is a direct threat. The third emerging threat that I classified here are actually the illegal marine scientific research activities. The illegal marine scientific research activities, I see it as part of the phases of Chinese aggression. So we've already seen the pattern in the speakers in the first half of the session have already discussed the different traditional security threats in the area. But if we look at the pattern, the phase one of the aggression is really on the occupation exploitation. It is followed then by militarization and then reclamation. And then the establishment of security bases and solidifying the presence by militarization. And lastly, for example, in many of the man-made islands or artificial islands in the West Philippine Sea, China has entered this new phase of developing and utilizing the resources through marine scientific research activities. Why is it actually very important to China to utilize and do marine scientific research activities in the area? Because China sees the South China Sea not only as a food source. China understands very well the full potential of the area for food, for medicines, for biotechnological or medical resources, for ocean energy, for rare metals and other economically valuable materials. And because of that recognition, China invested in coming up or establishing research stations, scientific research stations in the South China Sea. They have now 3 operational, working, and fully equipped state-of-the-art research stations in the three man-made or artificial islands in the West Philippine Sea, including the one that you find in Meiji Reef in 2018, which was established in 2018, and the Yongshu Station and Zubi Station in 2020 and 2021, respectively. These are being operated by the Chinese Academy of Sciences. It is part of their long-term R&D plan and roadmap for the utilization of the resources in the South China Sea. They even established a new institution called Integrated Research Center for Islands and Reefs, just to really manage this research station. And the objective of this research stations is to explore, is to do an offshore experiment, to be an offshore experimental base to solve science and technology problems on the ecological environment, resource utilization, and sustainable development of the South China Sea. So they're now gearing towards that. And remember that we cannot use whatever we don't know. It is through marine scientific research activity that we determine what are the possible resources out there and how we can utilize them. For an example, this is a new study or article that was just published this year, coming up with the assessment of the fisher stocks based on the three stations in the South China Sea. Again, understanding how the fishers work will allow them to exploit the resources more. Another is that many of the activities they're doing, or although they probably for the general public it's non-harmful and very subtle, many of the scientific publications coming up from these stations and also from the other features within the EEZ of the Philippines, many of the scientific work in international publications do not acknowledge the waters as part of the Philippines. You will not see any mention that these areas are actually within the EEZ or territory of the Philippines. And this is problematic because these are international documentation, allowing them to assert and document their claims in the area. Very subtle, but actually very effective. South China Sea, understanding the environments around it will also allow China to come up with technologies to increase their food production and therefore increase their food security. For example, they have now claimed that they can transform sand into soil technology, allowing them to have agricultural sustainability in the many islands that they are occupying in the Spratlys and around the South China Sea. By understanding the diversity of the area, the oceanography, the seasonality, the optimum conditions for farming, it would also allow them to actually come up with offshore mariculture technologies. There is now high potential for fish farming in Kalayaan Island Group using the offshore technologies that they've developed and are now rolling out in Norway. I don't see any why they would be limiting themselves to not also roll out such technology in the Kalayaan Island Group. It will also allow them to expand their seaweed farming since they have now this new environment where they can plant seaweeds that cannot grow in their own backyard in mainland China, and also expand their farming for sea urchin and other high-value products. All of this will contribute to food security and therefore would allow them for long-term occupation and sustained presence in the West Philippine Sea. It's not just to secure food, but also to secure their presence in the area. And what are the implications of their presence as well as their illegal MSRs to the benefit of to the possible benefits that the Filipino people could be gaining from the West Philippine Sea because of their presence and the presence of their paramilitia and military and coast guards. It also limits the access to our Filipino researchers. The photo that you are seeing, so this is actually a video. This is a video of us trying to cross the Pag-asa Lagoon, going from Pag-asa Island to Cays 3 and 4, near the Mischief Reef, and then near the Subi Reef. There are certain areas that we would like to study as part of our, more expansive studies in the Kalayaan Island Group, in the Pag-asa Island. But because of the presence of these vessels, we cannot access them. And therefore, it also limits us in terms of data gathering and thus limits our understanding of the ecosystems in the West Philippine Sea. There is in several occasions, our planned expeditions have also been postponed or even totally canceled because of the security threats being posed by this paramilitia and Chinese Coast Guard vessels. Because all of this, the non-access to the area, them doing a lot of illegal MSR activities actually disenfranchise the Filipinos. Research and scientific information should then be part of our consideration of being a security issue. In terms of what we know, in terms of the resources that can be potentially exploited or maximized or utilized in the area, and in terms of how much we already know about the West Philippine Sea. The illegal MSR also has a long-lasting implication in terms of confidence building. It is shifting the paradigm on the role of science as a confidence building measure. As early as the 80s and the 90s, several scientists have already put forward the idea that MSR can be a possible avenue and a mechanism to engage different nations surrounding the South China Sea in partnership and confidence building without much controversy. Because again, science should be neutral, and whatever we learn through scientific endeavors will benefit all the claimant countries in the South China Sea. However, China has been using MSRs in the past years as a form of civilian activity to actually assert claims and show their power in the South China Sea. Illegal because they are within the EEZ of the country. Therefore, they need to undergo the process of securing MSR permit. The process itself allows the development of confidence as well as transparency. It also makes sure that any scientific activity being done by foreign entities within the EEZ of the Philippines would have a counterpart on the part of the Filipino scientific community. So it could promote confidence building, but China is not following these norms. It's not following the guidelines. It's not going through the process. Thus, it narrows the options and making the collaboration very difficult because it casts doubts on the joint MSR activities. It casts doubts on the intention of joint MSRs, and it casts doubts on how are we going to trust each other and therefore move together as a region. Now, from all of these issues, from the continuing to the new and emerging non-traditional security threats in the area, how can we move forward towards a multilateral development in the South China Sea or in the region? All of these issues for me also translate into opportunities, especially for the Philippines. One option that we can look at is expanding the joint ocean marine scientific research expedition. So the Philippines and Vietnam have carried out successfully the phase 1 of JOMSTRE, Joint Ocean Maritime Marine Science Research Expedition in the seas of the South China Sea. They have moved on now, and just last week, the joint permanent working group between the two countries have agreed to actually resume talking about the phase 2 of JOMSTRE. And this is a very good example on how science can be used to again gain confidence of each other, exchange expertise, and also gain more understanding of the environments and how to protect them in the South China Sea. This is an opportunity for the Philippines and Vietnam because if it is proven to be possible to be done, then we can expand it to the invitation to the other countries. It is also very timely and really an opportunity for the Philippines because if we want to do joint ocean marine scientific research initiatives, therefore we should also have the capacity to actually the capacity that is at par with other countries. And just last year and this year, we've started building our own national academic research fleet. Just to give you an insight, for the past 20 plus years, the UPMSI, being the National Center for Marine Science Research, did not have its own research vessel. But through the help of the UP system and through the help of the Philippine government, the national government, we are now starting to establish our own national academic research fleet. We now have one called MY Panata that is already doing periodic MSR activities in the West Philippine Sea, but we are looking at expanding these activities more by procuring 4 more vessels, which will be stationed in the different oceans and biogeographic provinces in the country, including the Philippine Rice, the Visayan Seas, the Sulu Sea, and the Mindanao Sea. And of course, vessels that are dedicated for the West Philippine Sea. So having this capacity and facility upgraded would allow us to have more confidence in inviting other countries to do joint ocean marine scientific research expeditions. The MSI, coming from the ecological scientific perspective, is also pushing for the network of marine protected areas. Yes, we do have disputes in terms of the extent of our claims, but our idea is that while talking about the dispute, then probably we can say whatever we can while we talk about the dispute, while we talk about our claims. So what we want is to have a network of marine protected areas in the different parts of the South China Sea to sustain the productivity and the connectivity of the ecosystem. One possibility here is that this is very special because it was the first time that we were able to visit Ayungin Shoal this year. So this is a satellite image showing you how productive Ayungin Shoal is. It is then one of the possible areas that we can protect because it is very productive. So the green color inside shows you that there's a lot of phytoplankton or chlorophyll, and chlorophyll is the main food of many marine organisms. Therefore, higher chlorophyll would mean higher productivity. So there is still hope. Many environments remain highly productive and biodiverse, and continuously protecting them will also protect our interests in terms of fisheries, in terms of food, in terms of ecological services in the West Philippine Sea. The other significant progress or development, I think, in terms of our MSR initiatives in the West Philippine Sea is the revival, relaunch, and operationalization of the Pag-asa Island Research Station. I mentioned earlier that China has three, but at least now we have one in Pag-asa Island, which is called the Piers. The Philippines and China are not the only countries that have marine research stations. Ito Aba has its own, Taiwan has its own in the northern part, Malaysia and Indonesia have their own in the south, and Vietnam have their own in the west. So coming up with a network of research stations will allow us to have a regional long-term monitoring work, long-term plastics monitoring activities, and then more studies on the migration and connectivity of the different organisms within the South China Sea. So at least it allows us to have issues to solve as a region without talking about much on the claims or the controversial parts of the claims of in the West Philippine Sea or the South China Sea. Now, just to contribute on some of the discussions on the challenges that I would like to pose onto the next administration, I think there is a need for the next administration to look at continued investment in the MSR activities, not only in the West Philippine Sea, but other areas of the country. We also need to come up with a long-term R&D plan for the West Philippine Sea, the Philrise, and other high seas of the country. If you look at the research agenda of the different institutions, they're very fragmented. They would only last for 2 to 3 years, and there is no long-term plan. So what we want is a long-term R&D plan for the West Philippines in other areas of the country. There is also a need to create a new department called Department of Fisheries and Oceans. If we want to manage the fisheries, if we want to adapt to the effects and challenges of climate change, we need to understand that they are working in this bigger ecosystem that is the ocean. So we need to have the concepts of the oceans integrated into our fisheries management methods and measures. And also, I'd like for the next administration to support the Blue Economy Roadmap. As a country that is made up of 82% waters, there is no other way for development but towards the blue ocean, and that would be through the blue economy. So with that, I'd like to thank you again for the opportunity. I leave you with this quote from the founding director of the MSI, Dr. Heydaryan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deo. And so for our last speaker for this panel, may I kindly call on Dr. Sherwin Ona. He's Associate Professor of Political Science at De La Salle University. Dr. Ona will discuss the challenges and opportunities on cybersecurity in the Indo-Pacific region as presented in his special study entitled Digitalization Agenda 2022 Towards a Resilient Philippines Through Digital Transformation and Inclusion. Sherwin?
Thank you, Charmaine. Thank you for that introduction. Good day to everyone. First of all, allow me to thank the Albert Del Rosario Strat-based ADRI for having me today. I understand I'm the last speaker, which means that I'm the reason between you and having a good lunch. So just bear with me. I'll make it short but sweet. I don't intend to go beyond the 10 minutes allocation, but I'll just share with you my screen and shut down my video, turn off my video. All right, can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. This is the title of my presentation, Cybersecurity in the Age of Digitalization, Recommendation for Future Filipino Leaders. The outline of my presentation, very short. I intend to discuss digital transformation and how cybersecurity figures in. I intend to present the snapshot of my paper titled Digitalization Agenda 2022 and present some recommendations for our future Filipino leaders. Now, let me start my presentation with a story. This guy, Professor Willis Ware, considered as the father of computer security, back in the 60s, he ominously, or he rightly predicted that computers will be miniaturized. Okay. Well, please remember, or please note that computers during this time were placed inside huge laboratories. And Professor Ware predicted that it will be miniaturized and data will not be centralized, meaning data will be spread into a network. And his part of his ominous prediction was that because of this decentralization and miniaturization of computer resources, there'll be issues on security and privacy. In fact, he rightly predicted that computers will be used both to combat crime and to perpetrate crime. Now, of course, the 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 laboratory size of computers back in the day, the computing power are all equivalent to the size of your mobile phones right now. And this perhaps explain why, in spite of the pandemic, we have seen an increase in consumer activity online, online purchases. We have seen an increase in the access to telemedicine and a huge increase in digital purchases. This is in spite the fact that many households have yet to still have access to the internet, especially in least developed countries. Even prior to the pandemic, Asean is seen as a hotspot for digitalization and digital transformation in particular, simply because according to an OECD study, it is a hub for technological unicorns specializing on automation of the supply chain, e-logistics, and e-commerce. And according to the same report by OECD, we will see a rapid increase in small package delivery or e-logistics applications even by 2025. So everything is being presented to us in a rosy manner. But of course, on the other hand, however, on the other side of the coin, during the same pandemic period, we have experienced a 100% increase in cyber attacks, in particular on our global transportation and supply chains. And according to a McAfee survey, 81% of global organizations reported that they experienced cyber attacks in some form. And 79% of these respondents said that, reported that they experienced downtimes. So the attacks were really significant. And depending on who you ask, the global cost can range from $1 trillion to $6 trillion, right? So it's really very significant. Now, of course, there's been much discussion about non-traditional threats. And looking at the pandemic, okay, and looking at cyber threats, which are both non-traditional threats, we can see that the nature of non-traditional threats is really very fluid. Okay, we've seen that the pandemic has the ability to spawn other non-traditional dangers, such as threats from cyberspace. And in fact, during the pandemic, we have seen a rise in cyber crimes, the form of online scams, malware infection, ransomware, etc. We have also seen the spread of misinformation and even disinformation. And this is not only during COVID, but we have seen this happening in other health emergencies or pandemics, such as Ebola back in 2013. In a presentation of a previous speaker, it was mentioned that it has an effect on our democratic institutions. And in the United States, it's a good example of how the pandemic and misinformation, disinformation through cyberspace can result to the undermining or weakening of democratic institutions. And what's alarming is that we're not dealing with states mainly. Well, of course, some of you will argue that non-state actors are really surrogates of, big states, no? But we are mainly seeing non-state actors perpetrating these attacks. Okay, either they be terrorists or what we call as hacktivists. And of course, using the realist perspective, we've seen that cyberspace and the use of information is being part of a new domain of warfare, as evidenced by gray warfare, information warfare. So it's very ominous, right? Would you agree? Now, what's in store for our future leaders? Now, I wrote a paper for Strat-based ADRI titled Digitalization Agenda 2022. And in that paper, I propose that our incoming leaders, okay, adopt a digitalization agenda. Okay, and that digitalization agenda can be seen in three ways. First, the adoption of digital transformation, the concept of digital transformation in government. And you can see this, for instance, in the idea of service interoperability. How do we combine our services? Instead of having siloed, department-centric or local government-centric services, how do we combine this to really achieve cost efficiency? Okay. How do we now manage data? How do we now protect our citizens? How do we preserve privacy rights? Okay. Does this mean that we will adopt a new governance model? Are we seeing the likes of what Estonia is doing? Estonia having, most of their government services online. Okay. Do we now still value openness and transparency? Definitely, I would support that idea. In addition, there is also a need not only to look at digital transformation of government, but also look at the idea or adopt the idea of digital inclusion. Does that mean we look at marginalized areas? During the pandemic, major sectors have taken a hit, in particular, education and micro and small medium scale enterprises. In my paper, I made a case that our future leaders should prioritize these sectors along with other marginalized sectors, right? But in order to push really the full reopening of our economy, at least the focus should be on these two sectors. And lastly, I made the point that, encouraging digital adoption of digitalization, okay, means that we also need to protect our digital infrastructure. Okay. And you might be wondering right now, Sherwin, can we really achieve that? No, tagal na nating pinag-uusapan yan eh. Okay. Well, if you look at the World Bank report, 2020 World Bank report, it will be an uphill climb for the Philippines. Okay. It states that, of course, 60% of Filipino households still have access to the internet. We have low broadband penetration. We're still an analog economy, okay, if you will believe that. And the cost of internet is high in the Philippines. Okay, but of course, if you want to be a cautious optimist, okay, you will look at the plus side. Okay, we can claim that Filipinos are digital natives. We're really primed to really partake in this digitalization of society, and this is evidenced by our penchant for being online. Okay, in fact, I think we have the highest rate of being online among so many countries. 11 hours We spend 11 hours a day online. Okay? And a social weather station survey revealed that Filipino adults, most Filipino adults who have access to internet, do have access to their social media accounts, and they get their news from social media, in particular Facebook. Now, if you go to the country rating, we have relatively high or good ratings in terms of e-participation and open government data. So positive po yan sa atin. And if we look at our fintech sector, I think we can classify our fintech center as emerging and vibrant. So we have a lot of opportunities being opened up here. However, on the policy side, of course, you've heard of the ease of doing business law, the national ID law, cybercrime and data privacy. Okay, we have all of these laws. However, in my opinion, I've written in the paper that most of these laws are fragmented. Okay, and does not really support the move towards digitalization. Okay, so for instance, when we talk of cybercrime, the cybercrime law is really penalizing the occurrence of cybercrime. Okay, it does not prepare the country to combat or to meet sophisticated threats in the future, like advanced persistent threats, disinformation, etc. Okay, and my claim is we really need to have this large piece of the puzzle called digital transformation of government and define what the goals are, which now leads us to the question of, do we now have the right competencies? Do we have the right structure? Is DICT enough to push for digitalization of our country? And do we have the right resources? In the paper, I also encourage the definition of the role of the private sector, civil society, and the academe. Now, if you, in this slide, the focus here is cybersecurity. Most of the interventions that we're into is on the individual level. Okay? Mainly to prevent crimes. Okay? Crime-centric ang cybersecurity natin eh, no? We encourage organizations to update their cybersecurity software applications, but this is more on an individual basis without any regulation. But what's missing, my dear friends, will be the state and society level. We need to see cyberspace as a source of non-traditional threat, using perhaps the lens of homeland security or the lens of human security. We can now define possible impacts, possible effects, the need for resiliency when we look at these new threats. How do we deal with advanced persistent threats like DDoS? How do we deal with non-state actors that we cannot apprehend? Okay. How do we now create institutions, new policies, and capabilities to enable us to respond to these new threats? Indeed, the country is at a crossroads. You will agree with me. And our future Filipino leaders will be given this, and they will probably ask, what will be our next move? In my paper, my recommendations are the following. It's very important that we have a roadmap. Very practical, hindi ba? In our previous plans, we don't have a roadmap. Okay? And in this roadmap, which includes milestones, activities, targets, priorities, we need to adopt a whole of society approach. Okay? What's missing in many of our e-government and digital transformation strategies is that the leadership side, the commitment of political leaders, most especially. In best practices, we have seen presidents and prime ministers leading digitalization efforts of their countries. And in my paper, I propose that an executive level task force be created to oversee the implementation of the digitalization strategy. I also propose that a digitalization summit be convened so that this will be really a whole of society approach. Okay, government can now encourage private sector, civil society to be part of it and to define their roles. Okay, I also suggested that there is a need to create communities of practice. This is not, a purely one-time, big-time investment. Okay, we need to develop competencies. We need to develop programs that will really harness the skills, okay, of our society. And I further propose that new laws on digital government, especially mentioning interoperability and data governance, and not only cybersecurity, but also the importance of a cyber defense policy, a whole of society approach on cyber threats. Let me just end with this. If Professor Ware was able to predict what will happen in the future, now is the time for us to not predict, but create the future that we want to be in. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Sherwin, for highlighting the significance and to also keep our eye out for threats in the cyber sphere. Okay. Now, in the interest of time, we will only be able to raise one question to our panelists, and I would like to ask in your respective areas of expertise. So, for Professor Melly, it's the way that we study non-traditional security. For Dr. Salvador, at the regional level of how we address these issues. For Deo in the marine environment, and for Sherwin in the cybersphere. What do you think is one singular and overarching challenge that cuts across all of these non-traditional challenges that we face? And my reason for asking this question is if we can find a common theme, a common challenge, a common problem that cuts across, whether it's marine environment or cyber security or disaster relief, is there one, or can we even identify a singular and overarching challenge across this vast issue of non-traditional challenges? So perhaps I can ask first Professor Anthony.
Thank you, Charmaine. There are many ways of answering that, and I think your question needs to be parsed out. I understand the need to have a very overarching challenge. You can say it's the big G, that's globalization. That's why we have all of these challenges brought on by, we have this problems with non-state actors doing illicit activities, including cybersecurity, etc. And because of our increasing connectivity, we have now problems with pandemics, with our increasing, with globalization, there's also increase in consumption. And that is why you have problems with, food resources, extractive industries, and that could perhaps then lead to countries expanding their activities and, and encroaching on other countries' territory. I mean, it's because of that, right? In fact, non-traditional security threats, the range of it is actually an offshoot of, three things actually. Globalization, that's one. Second is because of that, then we have, of course, climate change. When we have extractive industries, extractive activities, the way we deal with the environment, because we are trying to cope with all the multiple challenges, right? So it's that, and of course, there's another school of thought that says one way to address all of this is really to change the way we live. We're talking about circularity of the economies. We're talking about planetary approaches, etc. So that could be an overarching theme, which has been there in the past, but because it's become more acute, then we're faced with multiple challenges. But since this is the last question, and I think it is important, if I may just add this, because I don't know whether I will have the opportunity to say this anyways, is that, when you talk about crafting a foreign and security policy, I think it is important while we are consumed, while nation states are consumed with domestic issues, you really need to have to be more outward looking in perspective, because when you deal with these challenges, non-traditional security is there because of the transnational impact, both its origin and its effect. So you need to be more outward looking and at the same time anticipatory in looking at these issues, right? We talk about cyber threats and its multiple, multifaceted elements, I mean, these are all what we call, 21st century challenges, which really, seriously challenge the capacity of states and societies to deal with it. You can talk about multi-sectoral, whole of government approach, but at the same time, if you don't have that kind of outlook, and kind of vision, then it's hard. That could be another challenge as well. So I don't know whether I have adequately responded to your question, but it's multifaceted responses and challenges. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, ma'am. Dr. Salvador, would you like to share your insights on this?
Yes, Charmaine. I can identify a couple. Number one is the continuing thrust on territorial and sovereignty issues, perhaps defined in terms of what is traditional from a perspective of realism, specifically in decision-making in government. So I think this is one of the biggest danger that our policymakers, specifically in the foreign policy and security policy domains, are likely to confront if the focus in terms of utilization of resources and allocation of priorities would be on territorial issues defined in terms of traditional realist lens. Number two, I think, is the challenge of making foreign policy making and security planning itself participatory and inclusive, resonating to the points raised by Dr. Meli Caballero. Track two and the multi-sectoral approaches in being able to address non-traditional security threats are required given the altered security landscape. But I think it is a challenge because, of course, as we all know, security decision-making and foreign policy making remains to be a very exclusive terrain. But what I think is important now that we need to take into consideration as part of our learnings from the pandemic is the increasing importance of science. So I resonate the cause of Dr. Sherwin Ona, our colleague from De La Salle, that there's a need for us to bridge the gap between our traditional way of engaging our diplomacy and foreign policy and the requirements of science and climate diplomacy. But I think there is a challenge of making this very participatory and inclusive. And I think the third one, so instead of a couple of concerns, I'd like to bring in a third point, is there is also a greater challenge of being able to align our national security and foreign policy thrust with those of the region. One specific example is why, for instance, or the problem that Indonesia or ASEAN as a region encountered when Indonesia failed to incorporate what is recommended as the adoption of legislation on zero burning to address the haze issue affecting the region sometime in mid-2000s. So I think that convergence in terms of regional and national policy making is some major problems in view of assertions of maintaining one's sovereignty, etc. Thank you very much, Charmaine.
Thank you, ma'am. Deo?
Yeah, so probably, as an ecologist myself, I think the goal of each organism is to survive. And humans as a race, our goal is to make sure that our race will survive and each country will actually survive. And I think all of those initiatives and all of those actions are rooted to the fact that we want to sustain our population. And I think the overarching theme for me is really sustainability. And this has been extensively discussed in our platforms and our roadmap to survive and to sustain the developments that we have already been listed and detailed out in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We already have the targets. We just need to reach them. We just need to do something to actually make them a reality. And I would like also to remind everyone, I'm gonna grab the opportunity that we've entered the ocean decade decade from 2021 to 2030. And as a marine scientist, this is really an opportunity for the Philippines to lead the region, primarily because we are the most diverse country in the world. So we have that responsibility, and I hope we actually do something about it.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Sherwin.
Ako, all of the above, ha, Charmaine, ha. I definitely agree with the answers of all the speakers in this panel. But as far as digitalization and cybersecurity are concerned, I think leadership plays an important role here. Okay, we need, leaders that are digitally savvy, okay, that will be able to lead our country, yeah, in terms of having a clear agenda for the next 6 years, and converting this agenda, or gathering significant public interest in this agenda. The problem with digitalization is that it's often seen as a very techy field, or a technocratic field. But I think it's the responsibility of our political leaders to really transform this into something that our people can really understand and can really look forward to. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for your excellent presentations. I really learned a lot from each and every one of you. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our experts and our panelists for this second discussion group. And now to formally close our session for today, I would like to introduce the Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs, the Honorable Teodoro Locsin Jr., who would deliver his recorded closing remarks.
In the history of multilateralism and multilateral diplomacy, massive global disturbances usually triggered a groundswell of movements towards change. The Peace of Westphalia, the Vienna Congress, the creation of the League of Nations, and its less divided and more enduring re-establishment as the United Nations. All these followed successively wider and more terrible upheavals that upended the world. Our contemporary seismic shift is the COVID-19 pandemic. In this fight, there is no clear power play. Every country and everyone caught in the pandemic has been a victim, either directly afflicted by the deadly disease or grieved to the core by the irreplaceable loss of loved ones, by an enemy too small to be detected until it is too late, let alone defeated. Delineations such as major powers, middle powers, and developing states, among other lines and barriers in the international arena across and between, have, if not largely diminished, been set aside. For there is only one enemy, COVID-19 and its mutations. Only one weapon against it, vaccines. There is only one grand strategy shared by all. No one is safe until everyone is vaccinated. That alone will stop the relentless march of the virus all over the world. That alone will slow or seize its continuous mutations before one of them pierces the shield of existing vaccines. It goes without saying, COVID-19 has transformed the multilateral playing field and the nuances behind strategic partnerships and enmities. I've heard one side say publicly that this and that vaccine made by a rival is unacceptable, but privately acknowledged that all vaccines work and whispers to its allies to take whatever is available. The COVAX facility, established in April 2020 by the World Health Organization, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, reinforce the relevance and potential of multilateralism. Since the first vaccine got emergency validation from the WHO in December 2020, and COVAX's first vaccine delivery to Ghana in February 2021. It has delivered hundreds of millions of COVID-19 vaccine doses all over the world, including the Philippines. The world has found a way to evenly spread out the availability of this singular weapon. Abundantly supplied countries administering doses first to their citizens wanting to take them, then passing on unused supplies to the rest of the world before their expiration. One small beleaguered country turned it away. Its enemy had offered vaccines shortly before their expiration dates. Although expiring vaccines work as well as those administered earlier. Refusing the vaccine amounted to cutting one's nose to spite one's face. So, despite domestic prioritization and India's export shutdown early this year, COVAX has come through, though it is running short of supplies as more take the vaccine in donor countries. It is only when geopolitics is involved that multilateralism assumes a thin disguise for coalition warfare. Therefore, offer help, but be gracious to take no for an answer. Don't mix your offer with fighter jets. One state's humanitarian concern is another state's excuse for aggression. Sometimes it is one and the same state, wearing its heart on a camouflage sleeve with an assault rifle in its hands. I was in Glasgow for COP26 and again witnessed multilateralism as the best way forward in a situation not unlike a world war, or rather a war on the world looming in the horizon. Yet all countries and peoples are the aggressors in varying degrees, and all their posterity the victims. It is a war by the present waged against the not-too-distant future, as if we had another planet to take shelter on. We need to make things work faster. It shouldn't be hard. The enemy is us, the victims our posterity. We just have to tell ourselves to slow down. The richer more than the poor, the strong more than the weak. Take less than more. This way, problems with the potential to be triggered to exponential global proportions do not render moot the decision-making process. Multilateralism can impact the regions of the world's shared peace and security goals, though it can descend to military alliances for and against. It works better fighting a threat that threatens everyone equally, rather than for a purpose uniquely advantageous to one side to the detriment of the other. Following the Second World War, the first truly global one, all nations old or coming into being walked a singular path to peace in defiance of war and founded the United Nations. UN Secretary General Guterres said, "The UN Charter remains the moral compass to promote peace, advance human dignity and prosperity, and uphold human rights and the rule of law. This moral compass points in the only direction to conflict prevention by diplomacy, through peace and humanitarian operations, and nuclear disarmament. Though the last World War was conventional, yet pretty close to a nuclear one in devastation, and far exceeded it in the prolonged cruelty of its extermination. Global nuclear war will be instantaneous and complete in meting out extinction. The Philippines is mindful of multilateral, plurilateral, and regional security arrangements. Recently, the US, UK, and Australia entered an enhanced trilateral security partnership. I welcomed AUKUS warmly. I believe that security arrangements of powers friendly to the Philippines focus their combined force in unstable regions, instilling the fear of extinction which clears the mind sobers the judgment, and corrects the imbalance of power that encourages unilateral aggression. The more armed elements are at odds with each other, the grimmer the prospect of war's outcome. Therefore, the rosier the prospects of peace all around. Multilateral cooperation is vital in addressing terrorism, transnational crime, cybercrime, and other threats that are near impossible to track down and turn off conclusively. In international criminal operations, the lyric that it is a small world after all could not be truer. For these crimes, the global playing field has no margins, demarcating what is out of bounds. Criminal elements exploit blind, porous, and penetrable spots and gateways. Existing global interconnections, highways and corridors, and blazing new pathways of predation. I cannot fully give justice to the Philippine experience without talking about ASEAN, a regional grouping with really nothing in common, but the good sense to realize their geographical vulnerability to nearby and common threats, as well as geographical access for the common advantage. Outside empty rhetoric and in reality, there is no such thing as Asian, what more, Western values. Immanuel Kant conclusively proved there is only one universal, categorical imperative. Do not do unto others what you would not have others do to you. His Prussian exactitude is sufficient to ensure the universality of his wisdom. The recently adopted ASEAN Leaders' Declaration on upholding multilateralism reaffirms its importance, along with ASEAN's partnerships with external partners in addressing global concerns, pursuing shared goals of decency, and the complementary initiatives that narrow the development gap, thereby enhancing sub-regional development and promoting sustainable development and inclusive growth to ASEAN advantage and everyone else's beyond. As traditional and non-traditional threats increase in the Indo-Pacific region, external partners continue to engage ASEAN through ASEAN-centered mechanisms, such as the ASEAN Dialogue Partner Plus, ADMM, and EAS, to address these issues. In addition to COVAX, COVID-19 assistance to ASEAN member states from dialogue partners has been crucial in mitigating the effects of the pandemic and aiding national recovery efforts. ASEAN recognizes the value of fostering strategic partnerships towards regional and global development, peace, and stability. Last year, the EU and ASEAN elevated the relations to a strategic partnership after being dialogue partners for nearly 43 years. ASEAN and EU committed to enhancing economic and security cooperation to benefit 500 million ASEAN and EU citizens. This will further strengthen existing cooperation for maritime security and counter-terrorism and combat transnational crimes. Like ASEAN, the Philippines upholds its interest through bilateral strategic partnerships. That said, it is important to emphasize that all the Philippines' strategic pursuits are anchored first and foremost by our national interest and independent foreign policy. This year, we celebrate with Japan our first strategic partner, the 65th year of normalized diplomatic relations, and 10 years of strengthened strategic partnership. Our close cooperation with Japan has resulted in the continued enhancement of the Philippines' maritime law enforcement capabilities, maritime domain awareness, counterterrorism, and humanitarian assistance and disaster relief capabilities. Japan continues to pour valuable support towards the Duterte administration's Build, Build, Build program under the dynamic leadership of Secretary Art Tugade, as well as peace and development in Mindanao. Our relationship with another one of our strategic partners, the United States, has not been without challenges and complications. Notwithstanding, it remains an enduring friendship, personal in character and affectionate in expression between our two peoples, no less. Yes, that deep as key national interest. That is a given. We have the highest manifestation of strategic partnership between two states, a mutual defense treaty. An attack on one is an attack on the other, with commensurately all-out response from both. Defense and security engagement is the sheet anchor of Philippine-US bilateral relations that keeps us from drifting too far apart, too close to dangerous shoals, Thomas and others, by whatever names they are called. We recognize that the presence of the US in the region is crucial to the balance of power here. And the American is the only hegemony without imperial intentions. To the same end, we continue to develop strategic engagements with middle powers, including the Republic of Korea, Australia, India, and most especially Indonesia, a proven ally even in our domestic conflicts, and to expand our defense and security partnerships with them. With the rivalry of major powers cascading into the South China Sea, it is in our interest to pursue privileged bilateral relations alongside multilateral structures to serve as counterweights in power plays that undermine the rules-based international order. For players like the Philippines, multilateralism and strategic partnerships are sources of added strength in international relations, though the foremost consideration is to build up our strictly national defense. Smartly navigated and wisely optimized, all these can empower us to achieve foreign policy goals of material, strategic, even existential importance. Post-COVID, it would be wise for the Philippines to bring out its scorecard and evaluate existing multilateral engagements and strategic partnerships on the basis of national interest, and an envisioned global future that holds the entire nation's aspirations of security, prosperity, and freedom from threats in a highly interconnected world. From that benchmark, we can restart our work of strengthening and expanding mutually beneficial strategic partnerships and energizing multilateralism. Thank you and good morning to all.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us in the fourth session of the Pilipinas Conference. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to our participants. And see you again tomorrow morning. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks, Tindo. Maraming salamat. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.